Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. This week we're going to start reading The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Let's get right into it, shall we? The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Adventure 1, A Scandal in Bohemia. To Sherlock Holmes, she's always the woman. I've seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler. All emotions, and that one particularly, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen, but as a lover he never would have placed himself in a false position. He never spoke of the softer passions, save with a gibe and a sneer. They were admirable things for the observer, excellent for drawing the veil from men's motives and actions, but for the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions into his own delicate and finely adjusted temperament was to introduce a distracting factor which might throw a doubt upon all his mental results. Grit in a sensitive instrument, or a crack in one of his own lenses, would not be more disturbing than a strong emotion in a nature such as his. And yet there was but one woman to him, and that woman was the late Irene Adler, of dubious and questionable memory. I had seen little of Holmes lately. My marriage had drifted us away from each other. My own complete happiness, and the home-centered interest which rise up around the man who first finds himself master of his own establishment, were sufficient to absorb all of my attention, while Holmes, who loathed every form of society with his whole Bohemian soul, remained in our lodgings in Baker Street, buried among his old books, and alternating from week to week between cocaine and ambition, the drowsiness of the drug, and the fierce energy of his own keen nature. He was still, as ever, deeply attracted by the study of crime, and occupied his immense faculties and extraordinary powers of observation in following out those clues, and in clearing up those mysteries which had been abandoned as hopeless by the official police. From time to time I heard some vague account of his doings, of his summons to Odessa in the case of the Trepoff murder, of his cleaning up the singular tragedy of the Atkinson brothers at Trincomalee, and finally of the mission which he had accomplished so delicately and successfully for the reigning family of Holland. Beyond these signs of his activity, however, which I merely shared with the readers of the daily press, I knew little of my former friend and companion. One night, it was on the 20th of March, 1888, I was returning from a journey to a patient, for I had now returned to civil practice, when my way led me through Baker Street. As I passed the well-remembered door, which must always be associated in my mind with my wooing and with the dark incidents of the study in scarlet, I was seized with a keen desire to see Holmes again, and to know how he was employing his extraordinary powers. His rooms were brilliantly lit, and even as I looked up, I saw his tall, spare figure pass twice in a dark silhouette against the blind. He was pacing the room swiftly, eagerly, with his head sunk upon his chest and his hands clasped behind him. To me, who knew his every mood and habit, his attitude and manner told their own story. He was at work again. He had risen out of his drug-created dreams, and was hot upon the scent of some new problem. I rang the bell and was shown up to the chamber which had formerly been in part my own. His manner was not effusive. It seldom was, but he was glad, I think, to see me. With hardly a word spoken, but with a kindly eye, he waved me to an armchair, threw across his case of cigars, and indicated a spirit case and a gasogene in the corner. Then he stood before the fire and looked me over in his singular introspective fashion. "Wedlock suits you," he remarked. "I think, Watson, that you've put on 7½ pounds since I saw you." "7!" I answered. "Indeed, I should have thought a little more, just a trifle more, I fancy, Watson, and in practice again, I observe. You didn't tell me that you intended to go into harness." "Then how do you know?" "I see it, I deduce it. How do I know that you've been getting yourself very wet lately, and you have a most clumsy and careless servant girl?" "My dear Holmes, this is too much. You'd have certainly been burned if you'd lived a few centuries ago. It's true that I had a country walk on Thursday and came home in a dreadful mess, but as I've changed my clothes, I can't imagine how you deduce it. As to Mary Jane, she's incorrigible, and my wife has given her notice, but there again I fail to see how you worked it out." He chuckled to himself and rubbed his long, nervous hands together. "It's simplicity itself," said he, "that my eyes tell me. On the inside of your left shoe, just where the firelight strikes it, the leather is scored by 6 almost parallel cuts. Obviously, it had been caused by someone who's very carelessly scraped round the edges of the sole to remove crusted mud from it. Hence, you see, my double deduction that you'd been out in vile weather, you had a particularly malignant boot-slitting specimen of the London slavey. As to your practice, if a gentleman walks into my room spelling of iodoform, with a black mark of nitrate of silver upon his right forefinger, and a bulge on the right side of his top hat to show where he has secreted his stethoscope, I must be dull indeed if I don't consider him to be an active member of the medical profession." And I couldn't help laughing at the ease with which he explained his process of deduction. When I hear you give your reasons," I remarked, "the thing always appears to me to be so ridiculously simple that I could easily do it myself, though at each successive instance of your reasoning I'm baffled until you explain your process. And yet I believe that my eyes are as good as yours." "Quite so," he answered, lighting a cigarette and throwing himself down into an armchair. "You see, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear. For example, you've frequently seen the steps which lead up from the hall to this room." "Frequently. How often?" "Some hundreds of times." "Then how many are there?" How many? I don't know." "Quite so. You have not observed, and yet you've seen. That's my point. Now I know that there are 17 steps, because I have both seen and observed. By the way, since you're interested in these little problems, and since you're good enough to chronicle 1 or 2 of my trifling experiences, you may be interested in this." And he threw over a sheet of thick, pink-noted notepaper which had been lying open upon the table. "It came by the last post," said he. "Read it aloud." The note was undated and without either signature or address. "There will call upon you tonight, at 7:45, a gentleman who desires to consult you upon a matter of the very deepest moment. Your recent services to the royal houses of Europe have shown that you are one who may be safely trusted with matters that are of an importance which can hardly be exaggerated. This account of you have from all quarters received. Be in your chamber then at that hour, and do not take it amiss if your visitor wear a mask." "This is indeed a mystery. What do you imagine that it means?" "I have no data yet. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. But the note itself, what do you deduce from it?" I carefully examined the writing and the paper upon which it was written. The man who wrote it was presumably well-to-do," I remarked, endeavoring to imitate my companion's processes. "Such paper couldn't be bought from under £0.50 a packet. It's peculiarly strong and stiff." "Peculiar, that is the very word. It's not an English paper at all," said Holmes. "Hold it up to the light." I did so, and saw a large E with a small g, a capital P, and a large G with a small t woven into the texture of the paper. "Now what do you make of that?" asked Holmes. "The name of the maker, no doubt, or his monogram, rather." "Not at all. The G with a small t stands for Gesellschaft, which is German for company. It's a customary contraction like our C.O. P, of course, stands for papier. Now for the E.G., let us glance at our own Continental Gazetteer." He took down a heavy brown volume from his shelves. "Eglau, Eglaunowitz. Here we are, Egria. It's a German-speaking county in Bohemia, not far from Carlsbad. Remarkable as being the scene of death in Wallenstein, and for its numerous glass factories and paper mills. My boy, what do you make of that?" And his eyes sparkled, and he sent up a great blue triumphant cloud from his cigarette. "The paper was made in Bohemia?" I said. Precisely, and the man who wrote the note is German. Do you know the peculiar construction of his sentences? This account of you we have from all quarters received. A Frenchman or Russian couldn't have written that. It's a German who is so uncourteous to his verbs. It only remains, therefore, to discover what is wanted by this German, who writes upon Bohemian paper and prefers wearing a mask to showing his face. And here he comes, if I'm not mistaken, to resolve all our doubts." And as he spoke, there was a sharp sound of horses' hoofs and grating wheels against the curb, followed by a sharp pull at the bell, and Holmes whistled. "A pair by the sound." "Yes," he continued, glancing out the window. A nice little poem and a pair of beauties. 150 guineas apiece. There's money in this case, Watson, if there's nothing else." "I think that I had better go, Holmes." "Not a bit, Doctor. Stay where you are. I'm lost without my Boswell, and this promises to be interesting. It'd be a pity to miss it." "But your client—" "Never mind him. I may want your help, and so may he. Here he comes. Sit down in that armchair, Doctor. Give us your best attention." A slow and heavy step, which had been heard upon the stairs and in the passage, paused immediately outside the door, and then there was a loud and authoritative tap. "Come in," said Holmes, and a man entered who could hardly have been less than 6 feet 6 inches in height, with the chest and limbs of a Hercules. His dress was rich with a richness which would, in England, be looked upon as akin to bad taste. Heavy bands of astrakhan were slashed across the sleeves and fronts of his double-breasted coat, while the deep blue cloak which was thrown over his shoulders was lined with flame-colored silk and secured at the back, or rather secured at the neck, with a brooch which consisted of a single flaming beryl. Boots which extended halfway up his calves, and which were trimmed at the tops with rich brown fur, completed the impression of barbaric opulence which was suggested by his whole appearance. He carried a broad-brimmed hat in his hand, while he wore across the upper part of his face, extending down past the cheekbones, a black-visored mask, which he had apparently adjusted that very moment, for his hand was still raised to it as he entered. From the lower part of the face he seemed to be a man of strong character, with a thick hanging lip and a long straight chin, suggestive of resolution pushed to the length of obstinacy. "You had my note?" he asked with a deep, harsh voice and a strongly marked German accent. "I told you that I would call." He looked from one to the other of us, as if uncertain which to address. "Pray take a seat," said Holmes. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who is occasionally good enough to help me in my cases. Whom do I have the honor to address?" "You may address me as the Count von Kram, a Bohemian nobleman. I understand that this gentleman, your friend, is a man of honor and discretion whom I might trust with a matter of the most extreme importance. If not, I should much prefer to communicate with you alone." I rose to go, but Holmes caught me by the wrist and pushed me back into my chair. "It is both or none," said he. "You may say before this gentleman anything which you may say to me." And the Count shrugged his broad shoulders. "Then I must begin by binding you both to absolute secrecy for 2 years. At the end of that time the matter will be of no importance. At present it's not too much to say that it is of such weight it may have an influence upon European history." "I promise," said Holmes, "and I." "You will excuse the mask," continued our strange visitor. "The august person who employs me wishes his agent to be unknown to you, and I may confess at once that the title by which I have just called myself is not exactly my own." "I was aware of that," said Holmes dryly. "The circumstances are of great delicacy, and every precaution has to be taken to quench what might grow to be an immense scandal and seriously compromise one of the reigning families of Europe. To speak plainly, the matter implicates the great house of Ormstein, hereditary kings of Bohemia." "I was also aware of that," murmured Holmes, settling himself down in his armchair and closing his eyes. Our visitor glanced with some apparent surprise at the languid, lounging figure of the man who had been no doubt described to him as the most incisive reasoner and most energetic agent in Europe. Holmes slowly reopened his eyes and looked impatiently at his gigantic client. "If your Majesty would condescend to state your case, I should better be able to advise you," he remarked. The man sprang from his chair and paced up and down the room in uncontrollable agitation. Then, with a gesture of desperation, he tore the mask from his face and hurled it upon the ground. "You are right. I am the king. Why should I attempt to conceal it?" "Why, indeed," murmured Holmes. "Your Majesty had not spoken before I was aware that I was addressing Wilhelm von Ormstein, Grand Duke of Cassel-Felsten, and hereditary King of Bohemia." "But you can understand," said our strange visitor, sitting down once more and pressing his hand high over his white forehead, "you can understand that I am not accustomed to doing such business in my own person. Yet the matter was so delicate I couldn't confide it to an agent without putting myself in his power. I have come incognito from Prague for the purpose of consulting you." "Then pray consult," said Holmes, shutting his eyes once more. "The facts are briefly these. Some 5 years ago, during a lengthy visit to Warsaw, I made the acquaintance of the well-known adventuress Irene Adler. The name is no doubt familiar to you." "Kindly look her up in my index, Doctor," murmured Holmes, without opening his eyes. For many years he had adopted a system of docketing all paragraphs concerning men and things, so that it was difficult to name a subject or person on which he could not furnish at once any sort of information. In this case I found her biography sandwiched in between that of a Hebrew rabbi and that of a staff commander who had written a monograph upon the deep-sea fishes. "Let me see. Said Holmes. "Born in New Jersey in the year 1858, contralto, La Scala, prima donna Imperial Opera of Warsaw, yes, retired from the operatic stage, living in London, quite so. Your Majesty, as I understand, became entangled with this young person, wrote her some compromising letters, and is now desirous of getting those letters back." "Precisely, but how—" "Was there a secret marriage?" "No." "No legal papers or certificates?" "None." "Then I fail to follow your Majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity?" "There is the writing." "Oh, pooh-pooh, it's a forgery." "My private notepaper?" "Stolen." "My own seal?" "Imitated." "My photograph?" "Bought. We were both in the photograph." "Oh dear, that's very bad. Your Majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion." "I was mad, insane. You've compromised yourself seriously." "I was only Crown Prince then. I was young, but I'm 30 now." "It must be recovered." "We've tried and failed." "Your Majesty must pay. It must be bought." "She will not sell." "Stolen, then?" 5 attempts have been made. Twice burglars in my pay ransacked her house. Once we diverted her luggage when she travelled. Twice she's been waylaid. No result." "No sign of it?" "Absolutely none." And Holmes laughed. "It's quite the pretty little problem," said he. "But it's a very serious one to me," returned the king reproachfully. "Very indeed. And what does she propose to do with the photograph?" "To ruin me." "But how?" "I'm about to be married." "So I've heard." "To Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, second daughter of the King of Scandinavia. You may know the strict principles of her family. She's herself the very soul of delicacy. A shadow of a doubt as to my conduct would bring the matter to an end." "And Irene Adler?" "Threatens to send them the photograph. And she will do it. I know that she will do it. You don't know her, but she has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful of women and the mind of the most resolute of men. Rather than I should marry another woman, there are no lengths to which she would go." "None." "You're sure she's not sent it yet?" "I'm sure." "And why?" "Because she said she would send it on the day when the betrothal was publicly proclaimed." "And that will be next Monday." "Oh, then we have 3 days yet," said Holmes with a yawn. "That's very fortunate. I have 1 or 2 matters of importance to look into just at present. Your Majesty will, of course, stay in London for the present?" "Oh, certainly. You'll find me at the Langham under the name of Count von Crom." Then I'll drop you a line to let us know. Then I shall drop you a line to let you know how we progress. Pray do so. I shall be all anxiety. Then as to money, you have carte blanche. Absolutely. I tell you that I would give one of the provinces of my kingdom to have that photograph, and for present expenses. The king took a heavy chamois leather bag from under his cloak and laid it on the table. There are 300 pounds in gold and 700 in notes. Holmes scribbled a receipt upon the sheet of his handbook Holmes scribbled a receipt upon a sheet of his notebook and handed it to him. And Mademoiselle's address? It's Briony Lodge, Serpentine Avenue, St. John's Wood. Holmes took a note of it. One other question. Was the photograph a cabinet? It was. Then good night, your majesty, and trust that we shall have some good news soon for you. And good night, Watson, he added, as the wheels of the royal brougham rolled down the street. If you will be good enough to call tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, I should like to chat this little matter over with you. At 3 o'clock precisely, I was at Baker Street, but Holmes had not yet returned. The landlady informed me that he had left the house shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. I sat down beside the fire, however, with the intention of awaiting him, however long he might be. I was already deeply interested in his inquiry, for though it was surrounded by none of the grim and strange features which were associated with the two crimes I had already recorded, still the nature of the case and the exalted station of his client gave it a character of his own. Indeed, apart from the nature of the investigation which my friend had on hand, there was something in his masterly grasp of the situation and his keen, incisive reasoning which made it a pleasure to me to study his system of work and to follow the most quick, subtle methods by which he disentangled the most complex and inextricable mysteries. So accustomed was I to his invariable success that the very possibility of his failing had ceased to enter into my head. It was close upon 4 before the door opened, and a drunken-looking groom, ill-kempt and side-whiskered, with an inflamed face and disreputable clothes, walked into the room. Accustomed as I was to my friend's amazing powers in the use of disguises, I had to look 3 times before I was certain that it was indeed him. With a nod, he vanished into the bedroom, where he emerged in 5 minutes, tweed-suited and respectable, as of old, and putting his hands into his pockets, he stretched his legs out in front of the fire and laughed heartily for some minutes. "Well, really," he cried, and then he choked and laughed again until he was obliged to lie back, limp and helpless, in the chair. "What is it?" "It's quite too funny. I'm sure you could never guess how I employed my morning, or what I ended by doing." "I can't imagine. I suppose that you've been watching the habits and perhaps the house of Miss Irene Adler?" "Quite so, but the sequel was rather unusual. I'll tell you, however. I left the house a little after 8 o'clock this morning in the character of a groom out of work. There's a wonderful sympathy in Freemasonry among horsemen. Be one of them, and you'll know all there is to know. I soon found Briony Lodge. It's a bijou villa, with a garden at the back, but built out in front, right up to the road, 2 stories. Chubb locked the door, large sitting room on the right side, well furnished, with long windows almost to the floor, and those preposterous English window fasteners which a child could open. Beyond that there was nothing remarkable, save the passage window could be reached from the top of the coach-house. I walked round and examined it closely from every point of view, but I found nothing else of any interest. I then lounged down the street and found, as I expected, that there was a mews in a lane which runs down by one wall of the garden. I lent the osters a hand in rubbing down their horses, and received in exchange 2 pence, a glass of half and half, 2 fills of shag tobacco, and as much information I could desire about Miss Adler, to say nothing of a half-dozen other people in the neighbourhood whom I was not in the least interested, but whose biographies I was compelled to listen to. "And what of Irene Adler?" "Oh, she's turned all the men's heads down in that part. She's the daintiest thing under a bonnet on this planet, so say the Serpentine Mews to a man. She lives quietly, sings at concerts, drives out at 5 every day, and returns at 7 sharp for dinner. Seldom goes out at other times, except when she sings. Has only one male visitor, but a good deal of him. He's dark and handsome and dashing, and never calls less than once a day, and often twice. He's a Mr. Godfrey He's a Mr. Godfrey Norton of the Inner Temple. See the advantages of a cabman as a confidant. They had driven him home a dozen times from the Serpentine Mews, and knew all about him. When I listened to all they had to tell, I began to walk up and down near Brownie Lodge once more, and think over my plan of my campaign. This Godfrey Norton was evidently an important factor in the matter. He was a lawyer. That sounded ominous. What was the relation between them, and what the object of his repeated visits? Was she his client, his friend, or his mistress? If the former, she'd probably transferred the photograph to his keeping. If the latter, it was less likely. On the issue of this question depended whether I should continue my work at Briony Lodge, or turn my attention to the gentlemen's chambers in the temple. It was a delicate point, and it widened the field of my inquiry. I fear that I bore you with these details, but I have to let you see my little difficulties if you are to understand the situation. "I'm following you closely," I answered. I was still balancing the matter in my mind when a hansom cab drove up to Briony Lodge, and a gentleman sprang out. He was a remarkably handsome man, dark, aquiline, and mustached, evidently the man of whom I had heard. He appeared to be in a great hurry, shouted to the cabman to wait, and rushed past the maid who opened the door with the air of a man who was thoroughly at home. He was in the house about half an hour, and I could catch glimpses of him in the windows of the sitting-room, pacing up and down, talking excitedly, and waving his arms. Of her I could see nothing. Presently he emerged, looking even more flurried than before. As he stepped into the cab, he pulled a gold watch from his pocket and looked at it earnestly. "Drive like the devil," he shouted. "First to Gross and Henke's in Regent Street, and then to the Church of St. Monica in the Edgware Road. Half a guinea if you can do it in 20 minutes. Away they went, and I was just wondering whether I should not do well to follow them up, when in the lane came a little neat landau. The coachman with his coat only half buttoned and his tie under his ear, while all the tags of his harness were sticking out of the buckles. It hadn't pulled up before she shot out of the hall door and into it. I only caught a glimpse of her at the moment, but she was a lovely woman with a face that a man might die for. "The Church of St. Monica, John," she cried, "and half a sovereign if you reach it in 20 minutes. This was quite too good to lose, Watson. I was just balancing whether I should run for it, or whether I should perch behind her landau, when a cab came through the street. The driver looked twice at such a shabby fare, but I jumped in before he could object. The Church of St. Monica, and half a sovereign if you reach it in 20 minutes. It was 25 minutes to 12, and of course it was clear enough what was in the wind. My cabby drove fast. I don't think I've ever driven faster, but there were others there before us. The cab and the landau, with their steaming horses, were in front of the door when I arrived. I paid the man and hurried into the church. There was not a soul there save the two whom I had followed, and a surpliced clergyman who seemed to be expostulating with them. They were all three standing in a knot in front of the altar. I lounged up the side aisle like any other idler who's dropped into a church, and suddenly, to my surprise, the three at the altar faced round to me, and Godfrey Norton came running as hard as he could towards me. Thank God," he cried. "You'll do. Come, come." "What then?" I asked. "Come, man, come. Only 3 minutes, or it won't be legal." I was half dragged up to the altar, and before I knew where I was, I found myself mumbling responses which were whispered in my ear, and vouching for things of which I knew nothing, and generally assisting in the secure tying up of Irene Adler, spinster, to Godfrey Norton, bachelor. It was all done in an instant, and there was the gentleman thanking me on one side and the lady on the other, while the clergyman beamed on me in the front. It was the most preposterous position which I have ever found myself in my life, and it was the thought of it that started me laughing just now. It seems there had been some informality about their license, that the clergyman absolutely refused to marry them without a witness of some sort, and that my lucky appearance saved the bridegroom from having to sally out into the streets in search of a best man. The bride gave me a sovereign, and I mean it, and I mean to wear it on my watch chain and memorable occasion. "That's a very unexpected turn of affairs," said I, "and what then?" Well, I found my plans very seriously menaced. Very unexpected turn of affairs, said I. Don't you mind me accidentally turning on my stream? It's fine. Well, I found my plans very seriously menaced. It looked as if the pair might take an immediate departure, and so necessitate a very prompt and energetic measure on my part. At the church door, however, they separated, he driving back to the temple, and she to her own house. I shall drive out in the park at 5 as usual, she said as she left him, and I heard no more. They drove away in different directions, and I went off to make my own arrangements. Which are? Some cold beef and a glass of beer, he answered, ringing the bell. I've been too busy to think of food, and I'm likely to be busier still this evening. By the way, Doctor, I shall want your cooperation. I shall be delighted. You don't mind breaking the law? Not in the least, nor running a chance of arrest. Not in a good cause. Oh, the cause is excellent. Then I'm your man. I was sure that I might rely on you. But what is it you wish? When Miss Turner has brought in the tray, I'll make it clear to you. Now, he said as he turned hungrily on the simple fare that our landlady had provided, I must discuss it while I eat, for I have not much time. It's nearly 5 now. In 2 hours we must be on the scene of action. Miss Irene, or Madame, rather, returns from her drive at 7. We must be at Briony Lodge to meet her. And what then? You must leave that to me. I've already arranged what is to occur. There's only one point on which I must insist. You mustn't interfere, come what may. You understand? I am to be neutral? To do nothing whatsoever. There'll probably be some small unpleasantness. Do not join in it. It will end in my being conveyed into the house. 4 or 5 minutes afterwards, the sitting-room window will open. You're to station yourself close to that open window. Yes? You're to watch me, for I'll be visible to you. Yes. And when I raise my hand, like so, you will throw into the room what I give you to throw, and will at the same time raise the cry of fire. You quite follow me? Entirely. It's nothing very formidable, he said, taking a long cigar-shaped roll from his pocket. It's an ordinary plumber's smoke rocket, fitted with a cap at either end to make it self-lighting. Your task is confined to that. When you raise your cry of fire, it'll be taken up by quite a number of people. You may then walk to the end of the street, and I will rejoin you in 10 minutes. I hope that I've made myself clear. I am to remain neutral, to get near the window, to watch you, and at the signal to throw in this object, and then to raise the cry of fire and wait for you at the corner of the street? Precisely. Then you may rely entirely on me. That's excellent. I think, perhaps, that it's almost time that I prepare for this new role that I have to play. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned in a few minutes in the character of an amiable and simple-minded nonconformist clergyman. His broad black hat, baggy trousers and white tie, sympathetic smile, and general look of peering and benevolent curiosity were such as Mr. John Hare alone could have equalled. It was not merely that Holmes changed his costume. His expressions, his manner, his very soul seemed to vary with every fresh part he assumed. The stage lost a fine actor, even as science lost an acute reasoner when he became a specialist in crime. It was still 6:15 when we left Baker Street, and it was still wanted 10 minutes to the hour when we found ourselves in Serpentine Avenue. It was already dusk, and the lamps were being lighted just as we paced up and down in front of Briony Lodge, waiting for the coming of its occupant. The house was just such as I had pictured it from Sherlock Holmes's succinct description, but the locality appeared to be less private than I expected. On the contrary, for a small street and a quiet neighborhood, it was remarkably animated. There was a group of shabbily dressed men smoking and laughing in a corner, a scissors grinder with his wheel, 2 guardsmen who were flirting with a nurse girl, and several well-dressed young men who were lounging up and down with cigars in their mouths. "You see," remarked Holmes, as we paced to and fro in front of the house, "this marriage rather simplifies matters. The photograph becomes a double-edged weapon now. The chances are that she would be as averse to its being seen by Mr. Godfrey Norton as our client is to its coming to the eyes of his princess. Now the question is, where are we to find the photograph? Where indeed? It's most unlikely that she carries it about with her. It's a cabinet size, too large for easy concealment about a woman's dress. She knows that the king is capable of having her waylaid and searched. 2 attempts of the sort have already been made, so we may take it then that she does not carry it about with her. Where, then? Her banker or her lawyer. There is that double possibility, but I'm inclined to think neither. Women are naturally secretive, and they like to do their own secreting. Why should she hand it over to anyone else? She could trust her own guardianship, but she couldn't tell what indirect or political influence might be brought to bear upon a businessman. Besides, remember that she had resolved to use it within a few days. It must be where she can lay her hands upon it. It must be in her own house. But it's twice been burgled. Pfft, they didn't know how to look. But how will you look? I won't look. What then? I will get her to show me. But she'll refuse. She won't be able to. But I hear the rumble of wheels. It's her carriage. Now carry out my orders to the letter. As he spoke, the gleam of side-lights of a carriage came round the curve of the avenue. It was a smart little landau which rattled up to the door of Briony Lodge. As it pulled up, one of the loafing men at the corner dashed forward to open the door in the hope of earning a copper, but was elbowed away by another loafer who had rushed up with the same intention. A fierce quarrel broke out, which was increased by the 2 guardsmen, who took sides with one of the loungers, and by the time things resolved, there was one who was genuinely hot upon the other side. A blow was struck, and in an instant the lady, who had stepped from her carriage, was the centre of a little knot of flushed and struggling men, who struck savagely at each other with their fists and sticks. Holmes dashed into the crowd to protect the lady, but as he reached her he gave a cry and dropped to the ground, with all the blood running freely down his face. At his fall the guardsmen took to their heels in one direction, and the loungers in the other, while a number of better-dressed people, who had watched the scuffle without taking part in it, crowded in to help the lady and to attend to the injured man. Irene Adler, as I will still call her, had hurried up the steps, but she stood at the top with her superb figure outlined against the lights of the hall, looking back into the street. "Is the poor gentleman much hurt?" she asked. "He's dead!" cried several voices. "No, no, there's life in him," shouted another, "but he'll be gone before you can get him to a hospital." "He's a brave fellow," said a woman. "They'd have had the lady's purse and watch if it hadn't been for him. They were a gang, and a rough one, too. Oh, he's breathing now." "He can't lie in the street. May we bring him in, ma'am?" "Oh, sure. Bring him into the sitting-room. There's a comfortable sofa. This way, please." Slowly and solemnly he was borne into Briony Lodge, and laid out in the principal room, while I still observed the proceedings from my post by the window. The lamps had been lit, but the blinds had not been drawn, so that I could see Holmes as he lay upon the couch. I don't know whether he was seized with compunction at that moment for the part he was playing, but I know that I never felt more heartily ashamed of myself in my life than when I saw the beautiful creature against whom I was conspiring, or the grace and kindliness with which she waited upon the injured man. And yet it would be the blackest treachery to Holmes to draw back now from the part which he had entrusted me. I hardened my heart and took the smoke rocket from under my ulster. After all, I thought, we're not injuring her, we're but preventing her from injuring another. Holmes had sat up upon the couch, and I saw him motion like a man who is in need of air. A maid rushed across and threw open the window, and at the same instant I saw him raise his hand, and at the signal I tossed my rocket into the room with a cry of fire. The word was no sooner out of my mouth than the whole crowd of spectators, well dressed and ill, gentlemen, ostlers, and servant-maids, joined in a general shriek of fire. Thick clouds of smoke curled through the room and out into the open window. I caught a glimpse of rushing figures, and a moment later the voice of Holmes from within, assuring them that it was a false alarm. Slipping through the shouting crowd, I made my way to the corner of the street, and in 10 minutes was rejoiced to find my friend's arm in mine, and to get away from the scene of the uproar. He walked swiftly and in silence for some minutes, until we had turned down one of the quiet streets which led toward the Edgware Road. "You did it very nicely, Doctor," he remarked. "Nothing could have been better. It's all right. You have the photograph?" "I know where it is." "And how did you find out?" "She showed me, as I told you she would. I'm still in the dark." "I do not wish to make a mystery," said he, laughing. "The matter was perfectly simple. You, of course, saw that everyone in the street was an accomplice. They were all engaged for the evening." "I guessed as much." "Then when the row broke out, I had a little of moist red paint in the palm of my hand. I rushed forward, fell down, clapped my hand to my face, and became a piteous spectacle. It's an old trick." "That, also, I could fathom." "Then they carried me in. She was bound to have me in. What else could she do? And into her sitting room, which was the very room which I suspected. It lay between that and her bedroom, and I was determined to see which. They laid me on a couch, I motioned for air, they were compelled to open the window, and you had your chance." "How did that help you?" "It was all important. When a woman thinks that her house is on fire, her instinct is at once to rush to the thing which she values most. It's a perfectly overpowering impulse, and I have more than once taken advantage of it. In the case of the Darlington substitution scandal, it was of use to me, and also in the Arnsworth Castle business. A married woman grabs at her baby, and an unmarried one reaches for her jewel box. Now it was clear to me that Our Lady of today had nothing in the house more precious to her than what we are in quest of. She would rush to secure it. The alarm of fire was admirably done. The smoke and shouting were enough to shake nerves of steel. She responded beautifully. The photograph is in a recess behind her sliding panel, just above the right bell pull. She was there in an instant, and I caught a glimpse of it as she half drew it out. When I cried out that it was a false alarm, she replaced it, glanced at the rocket, rushed from the room, and I have not seen her since. I rose, and, making my excuses, escaped from the house. I hesitated whether to attempt to secure the photograph at once, but the coachman had come in, and he was watching me narrowly, so it seemed safer to wait. A little over-precipitance may ruin all. "And now?" I asked. "Our quest is practically finished. I shall call the king tomorrow, and with you, if you care to come with us. We'll be shown into the sitting room to wait for the lady, but it's probable that when she comes she may find neither us nor the photograph. Might be a satisfaction to His Majesty to regain it with his own hands." "And when will you call?" "At 8 in the morning. She won't be up, so that we may have a clear field. Besides, we must be prompt, for this marriage may mean a complete change in her life and habits. I must wire to the king without delay." We'd reached Baker Street and had stopped at the door. He was searching his pockets for the key when someone passing said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." There were several people on the pavement at the time, but the greeting appeared to have come from a slim youth in an ulster who had hurried by. "I've heard that voice before," said Holmes, staring down the dimly lit street. "Now I wonder who the deuce that could have been." I slept at Baker Street that night, and we were engaged upon our toast and coffee in the morning when the King of Bohemia rushed into the room. "You've really got it?" he cried, grasping Sherlock Holmes by either shoulder and looking eagerly into his face. "Not yet." "But you have hopes?" "I have hopes." "Then come, I'm all impatience to be gone." "We must have a cab." "No, my brougham is waiting." "Then that will simplify matters." We descended and started off once more for Briony Lodge. "Irene Adler is married," remarked Holmes. "Married? When?" "Yesterday." "But to whom?" "To an English lawyer named Norton." "But she couldn't love him." "I'm in hopes that she does." "And why are you in hopes?" "Because it would spare your Majesty all fear of future annoyance. If the lady loves her husband, she does not love your Majesty. If she doesn't love your Majesty, there's no reason why she should interfere with your Majesty's plan." "It's true, and yet, well, I wish she had been made of my own station. What a queen she would have made." He relapsed into a moody silence which wasn't broken until we drew up in Serpentine Avenue. The door of Briony Lodge was open, and an elderly woman stood upon the steps. She watched us with a sardonic eye as we stepped from the brougham. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe," said she. "I am Mr. Holmes," answered my companion, looking at her with a questioning and rather startled gaze. "Indeed, my mistress told me that you were likely to call. She left this morning with her husband by the 5:15 tram for the Charing Cross for the Continent." "What?" Sherlock Holmes staggered back, white with chagrin and surprise. "Do you mean that she's left England?" "Never to return." And the papers? All is lost?" asked the king, hoarsely. "We shall see." He pushed past the servant and rushed into the drawing-room, followed by the king and myself. The furniture was scattered about in every direction, with dismantled shelves and open drawers, as if the lady had hurriedly ransacked them before her flight. Holmes rushed to the bell-pull, tore back a small sliding shutter, and plunging in his hand, pulled out a photograph and a letter. The photograph was Irene Adler herself in evening dress. The letter was superscribed for Sherlock Holmes, Esquire, to be left till called for. My friend tore it open, and we all three read it together. It was dated at midnight of the preceding night, and ran in this way. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you really did it very well. You took me in completely. Until after the alarm of fire I had not a suspicion. But then, when I found how I had betrayed myself, I began to think. I had been warned against you months ago. I had been told that if the king employed an agent it would certainly be you, and your address had been given to me. And yet with all this you made me reveal what you wanted to know. Even after I became suspicious, I found it hard to think evil of such a dear, kind old clergyman. But you know I've been trained as an actress myself. Male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the skills which it gives. I sent John, the coachman, to watch you, ran upstairs, got into my walking clothes, as I call them, and came down just as you departed. Well, I followed you to your door, and so made sure that I was really an object of interest to the celebrated Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Then rather I impudently wished you good night, and started for the temple to see my husband. We both thought the best resource was flight, when pursued by so formidable an antagonist, so you'll find the nest empty when you call tomorrow. As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he's cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself, and to preserve a weapon which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future. I leave a photograph which he might take care to possess, and I remain, dear Sherlock Holmes, your very truly yours, Irene Norton, née Adler." "What a woman! Oh, what a woman!" cried the King of Bohemia, when we had all three read this epistle. "Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she not have made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity she was not on my level?" "From what I've seen of the lady, she seems, indeed, to be on a very different level to your Majesty," said Holmes coldly. "I'm sorry that I've not been able to bring your Majesty's business to a more successful conclusion." "On the contrary, my dear sir, nothing could be more successful. I know that her word is inviolate. The photograph is now as safe to me as if it were in the fire." "I'm glad to hear your Majesty say so." "I'm immensely indebted to you. Pray tell me, how can I reward you? This ring!" He slipped an emerald snake ring from his finger, and held it out upon the palm of his hand. "Your Majesty has something on which I should value even more highly," said Holmes. "You have but to name it." "This photograph," and the king stared at him in amazement. "Irene's photograph? Certainly, if you wish it." "I thank your Majesty. Then there's no more to be done in the matter. I have the honour to wish you a very good morning." He bowed, and turning away without observing the hand which the king had stretched out to him, he set off in the company of myself for his chambers. That was how a great scandal threatened to affect the kingdom of Bohemia, and how the best plans of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were beaten by a woman's wit. He used to make merry over the cleverness of women, but I've never heard him do it of late, and when he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it was always under the honourable title of the woman. Adventure 2. The Red-Headed League. I had called upon my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes one day in the autumn of last year, and found him in deep conversation with a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair. With an apology for my intrusion, I was about to withdraw when Holmes pulled me abruptly into the room and closed the door behind me. You could not possibly have come at a better time, my dear Watson," he said cordially. "I was afraid that you were engaged." "So I am, very much so." "Then I can wait in the next room." "Not at all. This gentleman, Mr. Wilson, has been my partner and helper in many of my most successful cases, and I have no doubt that he'll also be of the utmost use to me in yours also." The stout gentleman half rose from his chair and gave a bob of greeting, with a quick little questioning glance from his small, fat, encircled eyes. "Try the settee," said Holmes, relapsing into his armchair, and putting his fingertips together as was his custom when in judicial moods. "I know, my dear Watson, that you share my love of all that is bizarre and outside the conventions of humdrum routine of everyday life. You've shown your relish for it by the enthusiasm which has prompted you to chronicle it, and, if you'll excuse my saying so, somewhat to embellish so many of my own little adventures." "Your cases have been indeed of the greatest interest to me," I observed. "You will remember that I remarked the other day, just before we went into the very simple problem presented by Miss Mary Sutherland, that for the strange effects and extraordinary combinations we must go to life itself, which is always far more daring than any effort of the imagination." "A proposition which I took the liberty of doubting." "You did, Doctor, but none the less you must come round to my view, for otherwise I shall keep piling fact upon fact on you, until your reason breaks down under them and you acknowledge me to be correct. Now Mr. Jabez Wilson here has been good enough to call upon me this morning, and to begin a narrative which promises to be one of the most singular which I have listened to for some time. You've heard me remark that the strangest and most unique things are often very connected, not with the larger, but with the smaller crimes, and occasionally, indeed, where there is room for doubt whether any positive crime has been committed. As far as I've heard it, it's impossible for me to say whether the present case is an instance of crime or not, but the course of events is certainly among the most singular that I've ever listened to. Perhaps, Mr. Wilson, you would have the great kindness to recommence your narrative. I ask you not merely because my friend Dr. Watson has not heard the opening part, but also because the peculiar nature of the story makes me anxious to hear every possible detail from your lips. As a rule, when I have heard some slight indication of the course of events, I am able to guide myself by the thousands of other similar cases which occur to my memory. In the present instance, I am forced to admit that the facts are, to the best of my belief, unique." The portly client pumped out his chest with an appearance of some little pride, and pulled a dirty and wrinkled newspaper from the inside pocket of his greatcoat. As he glanced down the advertisement column, with his head thrust forward and the paper flattened out upon his knee, I took a good look at the man and endeavoured, after the fashion of my companion, to read the indications which might be presented by his dress or appearance. I didn't gain very much, however, by my inspection. Our visitor bore every mark of being an average, commonplace British tradesman, obese, pompous, slow. He wore rather baggy grey shepherd's check trousers, a not over-clean black frock coat, unbuttoned at the front, and a drab waistcoat with a heavy, brassy Albert chain, and a square pierced bit of metal dangling down as an ornament. A frayed top hat and a faded brown overcoat, with a wrinkled velvet collar, lay upon a chair beside him. Altogether, look as I would, there was nothing remarkable about the man save his blazing red head, and the expression of extreme chagrin and discontent upon his features. Sherlock Holmes's quick eye took in my occupation, and he shook his head with a smile as he noticed my questioning glances. Beyond the obvious facts, that he's done some manual labour at some time, that he takes snuff, that he's a Freemason, that he's been in China, that he's done a considerable amount of riding lately, I can deduce nothing else." Mr. Jabez Wilson started up in his chair with his forefinger upon the paper, but his eyes upon my companion. How in the name of good fortune did you know all that, Mr. Holmes? How did you know, for example, that I did manual labour? It's true as gospel, for I began as a ship's carpenter." "Your hands, my dear sir, your right hand is quite a size larger than your left. You've worked with it, and the muscles are more developed." "Well then, the snuff and the Freemasonry?" "I won't insult your intelligence by telling you how I read that, especially as, rather against the strict rules of your order, you use an arc and compass breastpin." "Of course, I forgot that. But the writing? What else can be indicated by that right cuff so very shiny for 5 inches, and the left one with a smooth patch near the elbow where you rested upon the desk?" "Yes, but China? The fish you have tattooed immediately above your right wrist could only have been done in China. I've made a small study of tattoo marks, and have even contributed to the literature of the subject. The trick of staining the fish's scale a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When in addition I see a Chinese coin hanging from your watch chain, the matter becomes ever more simple." And Mr. Jabez Wilson laughed heavily. "Well, I never. I thought at first you'd done something clever, but I see that there was nothing in it after all." "I begin to think, Watson, that I make a mistake in my explaining. Omne ignosium pro magnifico, you know, and my poor little reputation, such as it is, will suffer shipbreak if I'm so candid. Can you not find the advertisement, Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, I've got it now," he answered, with his thick red finger planted halfway down the column. "Here it is. This is what began it all. You just read it for yourself, sir." I took the paper from him and read as follows: "To the Red-Headed League. On the account of the behest of the late Ezekiel Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, U.S. of A., there is now another vacancy open which entitles a member of the League to a salary of £4 a week purely for nominal services. All red-headed men who are sound in body and mind and above the age of 21 years are eligible. Apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the offices of the League, 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street." "What on earth does this mean?" I ejaculated after I'd read twice over the extraordinary announcement. Holmes chuckled and wriggled in his chair, as was his habit when he was in high spirit. "It is a little off the beaten track, isn't it? And now, Mr. Wilson, off you go at scratch, and tell us all about yourself, your household, the effect which this advertisement had upon your fortunes. You'll first make a note, Doctor, of the paper, and the date." "It's the Morning Chronicle of April 27th, 1890, just 2 months ago." "Very good. Now, Mr. Wilson?" "Well, it's just as I've been telling you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Jabez Wilson, mopping his forehead. "I have a small pawnbroker's business at Coburg Square, near the city. It's not a very large affair, and of late years it's not done more than just give me a living. I used to be able to keep 2 assistants, but now I only keep 1, and I would have a job to pay him, but that he's willing to come for half wages so as to learn the business." "And what is the name of this obliging youth?" "His name's Vincent Spaulding, and he's not such a youth either. It's hard to say his age. I shouldn't wish a smarter assistant, Mr. Holmes, and I know very well that he could better himself and earn twice what I'm able to give him. But after all, if he's satisfied, why should I put ideas in his head?" "Why, indeed? You seem most fortunate in having an employee who comes under the full market price. It's not a common experience among employers in this age. I didn't know that your assistant is not unremarkable as your advertisement." "Oh, he has his faults, too. Never was such a fellow for photography, snapping away with a camera when he ought to be improving his mind, driving down into the cellar like a rabbit into its hole to develop his pictures. That's his main fault, but on the whole he's a good worker. There's no vice in him." "He's still with you, I presume?" "Yes, sir. He and a girl of 14 who does a bit of simple cooking and keeps the place clean. That's all I have in the house, for I'm a widower and never had any family. We live very quietly, sir, the 3 of us. We keep a roof over our heads, pay our debts if we do nothing more. The first thing that put us out was that advertisement. Spaulding, he came down to the office just this day 8 weeks, with his very paper in his hand, and says, 'I wish to the Lord, Mr. Wilson, that I was a red-headed man.' 'Why's that?' I asked him. 'Why,' says he, 'there's another vacancy on the League of the Red-Headed Men. It's worth a quite little fortune to any man who gets it. I understand that there are more vacancies than there are men, so that the trustees are at their wits' ends what to do with the money. If my hair would only change colour, here's a nice little crib all ready for me to step into.'" "Why, what is that, then? You see, Mr. Holmes, I am a very,
"Why, what is that, then?" I asked. "You see, Mr. Holmes, I'm a very stay-at-home man, and as my business came to me, instead of my having to go to it, I was often weeks on end without putting my foot over the doormat. In that way I didn't know much of what was going on outside. I was glad of a bit of news. Have you ever heard of the League of Red-Headed Men?"
"Never."
"Why, I wonder at that."
Wait. Have you never heard of the League of Red-Headed Men?" he asked with his eyes open.
"Never."
"Why, I wonder at that, for you are eligible yourself for one of the vacancies."
"And what are they worth?"
"Oh, merely a couple of hundred a year, but the work is slight, and it need not interfere very much with one another's occupations."
"Well, you can easily think that made me prick up my ears, for the business has not been overly good for some years, and a couple hundred would have been very handy." "Tell me all about it," said I. "And well," said he, showing me the advertisement, "you can see for yourself the League has a vacancy. There's the address where you should apply for particulars. As far as I can make out, the League was founded by an American millionaire, Ezekiel Hopkins, who was very peculiar in his ways. He was himself red-headed, and he had a great sympathy for all red-headed men. So when he died, it was found that he'd left his enormous fortune in the hand of trustees, with instructions to applying the interest to providing the easy berths to men whose hair is of that colour. From all I hear, it's splendid pay and very little to do. But, said I, there would be millions of red-headed men who would apply, and not so many as you might think, he answered. You see, it really is confined to Londoners and grown men. This American had started from London when he was young, and he wanted the old town a good turn. Then again, I've heard it's no use applying if your hair's light red or dark red or anything but real bright, blazing, fiery red. Now, if you care to apply, Mr. Wilson, you could just walk in, but perhaps it'd be hardly worth your while to put yourself out of the way for the sake of a few £100. Now, it's a fact, gentlemen, that as you may see for yourselves, my hair is a very full and rich tint, so that it would be, if there was any to be competition in the matter, I stood as good a chance as any man that had ever met it, and Vincent Spaulding seemed to know just so much about it that I thought he might prove useful, so I ordered him to put up the shutters for the day and come right away with me. He was very willing to have a holiday, so we shut the business up and started off for the address as it was given to us in the advertisement. I hope never to see such a sight as that again, Mr. Holmes. From north, south, east, and west, every man who had a shade of red in his hair tramped into the city to answer the advertisement. Fleet Street was choked with red-headed folk, and Pope's Court looked like a coster's orange barrel. I shouldn't have thought there were so many in the whole country as they brought together by that single advertisement. Every shade of colour there were: straw, lemon, orange, brick, iris, setter, liver, clay. But as Spaulding said, there were not many who had the real, vivid, flame-coloured tint. When I saw how many were waiting, I could have given it up in despair, but Spaulding would not hear of it. How he did it I wouldn't imagine, but he pushed and pulled and butted until he got me through the crowd and right up the steps which led to the office. There was a double stream upon the stair, some going up in hope and some coming back dejected, but we wedged in as well we could and soon found ourselves in the office.
Your experience has been a most entertaining one, remarked Holmes as his client paused and refreshed his memory with a huge pinch of snuff. Pray continue your very interesting statement.
There was nothing in the office but a couple of wooden chairs and a deal table, behind which sat a small man with a head that was even redder than mine. He said a few words to each candidate as he came up, and then he always managed to find some fault in them which would disqualify them. Getting a vacancy didn't seem to be a very easy matter after all. However, when our turn came, the little man was much more favourable to me than any of the others, and he closed the door as we entered, so that he might have a private word with us. "This is Mr. Travers Wilson," said my assistant, "and he's willing to fill a vacancy in the League." "And he's admirably suited for it," the other answered. "He has every requirement. I cannot recall when I've seen anything so fine."
And he took a step backward, cocked his head on one side, and gazed at my hair until I felt quite bashful. Then suddenly he plunged forward, wrung my hand, and congratulated me warmly on my success.
"It would be injustice to hesitate," he said. "You will, however, I'm sure, excuse me for taking an obvious precaution." And he seized my hair with both his hands and tugged it until I yelled with the pain. "There's water in your eyes," he said as he released me. "I perceive that all is as it should be, but we have to be careful, for twice we've been deceived by wigs and once by paint. I could tell you tales of cobbler's wax which would disgust you with human nature." He stepped over to the window and shouted through to the top of his voice the vacancy was filled. A groan of disappointment came from below, and the folk all troped away in different directions until there wasn't a redhead to be seen except my own and that manager. "My name," said he, "is Duncan Ross, and I'm myself one of the pensioners upon the fund left by our noble benefactor. Are you a married man, Mr. Wilson? Have you a family?" And I answered that I had not, and his face fell immediately. "Dear me, that's very serious indeed. I'm sorry to hear you say that. The fund was, of course, for the propagation and spread of redheads as well as their maintenance. It's exceedingly unfortunate that you should be a bachelor." And my face lengthened at this, Mr. Holmes, for I thought that I was not to have the vacancy after all. But after thinking it over for a few minutes, he said that it would be all right. In the case of another, the objection might be fatal, but we must stretch a point in favour of a man such a head of hair as yours. When shall you be able to enter upon your new duties?" "Well, it's a little awkward, for I have a business already," said I, and "Oh, never mind about that," Mr. Wilson Spaulding said. "I should be able to look after that for you." "And what would be the hours?" "10 to 2. Now, our pawnbroker's business is mostly done of an evening, Mr. Holmes, especially Thursday and Friday evening, which is just a little before payday, so it should be very well to earn a little in the mornings. Besides, I knew that my assistant was a good man, and he'd see to anything that turned up." "That would suit me very well," said I, "and the pay? £4 a week, and the work is nominal." "What would you call nominal?" "Why, you have to be in the office, or at least in the building, the whole time. If you leave, you forfeit your position forever. The rule is very clear upon that point. You don't comply with the conditions if you budge from the office during that time." "It's only 4 hours a day, and I shouldn't think of leaving." "No excuse will avail, neither strictness, nor business, nor anything else. There you must say, or you lose your billet. And the work is to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's the first volume of that in your press. You must find your own ink, pens, and blotting paper, but we provide the table and chair. Will you be ready tomorrow?" "Certainly," I answered, "and then good-bye, Mr. Jabez Wilson, and let me congratulate you once more on the important position which you've been fortunate enough to gain." And he bowed me out of the room, and I went home with my assistant, hardly knowing what to say or do. I was so pleased at my own good fortunes, when I thought the matter over all day, and by evening I was in low spirits again, for I had quite persuaded myself the whole affair must be some sort of great hoax or fraud, though what its object might be I couldn't imagine. It seemed altogether past belief that someone would make such a will, or they'd pay such a sum for doing anything as simple as copying out the Encyclopedia Britannica. Vincent Spaulding did what he could to cheer me up, but by this bedtime I'd reasoned myself out of the whole thing. However, in the morning I determined to have a look at it anyhow, so I bought a penny bottle of ink and a quill pen and 7 sheets of foolscap paper, and I started off for Pope's Court. Well, to my surprise and delight, everything was right as possible. Table was set out ready for me, and Mr. Duncan Ross was there to see that I got fairly to work. He started me off upon the letter A, and then he left me, but he would drop in from time to time to see what was all right with me. At 2 o'clock he bade me good day, complimented me upon the amount that I'd written, and locked the office door after me. This went on day after day, Mr. Holmes, and on Saturday the manager came in and planked down 4 golden sovereigns for my week's work. It was the same next week, and the same the week after. Every morning I was there at 10, and every afternoon I left at 2. By degrees Mr. Duncan Ross took to coming in only once a morning, and then after a time he didn't come in at all. And still, of course, I never dared to leave the room for an instant, for I was not sure when he might come, and the billet was such a good one, it suited me so well, I would not risk loss of it. 8 weeks passed away like this, and I had written about abbots and archery and armour and architecture and Attica, and I hoped with diligence that I might get on the bees before very long. It cost me something in foolscap, and I'd nearly filled a shelf with my writings. And suddenly the whole business came to an end. An end? Yes, sir. No later than this morning I went to my work as usual at 10 o'clock, but the door was shut and locked, with a little square of cardboard hemmed to the middle of the panel with a tack. Here it is, and you can read for yourself." And he held up a piece of white cardboard about the size of a sheet of notepaper. It read in this fashion: "The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9th, 1890. Holmes and I surveyed this curt announcement and the rueful face behind it, until the comical side of the affair so completely overtapped every other consideration we both burst out into a roar of laughter. "I could not see that there is anything very funny," cried our client, flushing up to the roots of his flaming head. "If you can do nothing better than laugh at me, I can go elsewhere." "No, no," cried Holmes, shoving him back into the chair from which he had half risen. "I really wouldn't miss your case for the world. It's so refreshingly unusual. But there is, if you will excuse my saying so, something just a little funny about it. Pray, what steps did you take when you found the card upon the door?" "I was staggered, sir. I didn't know what to do. Then I was called to the offices round. None of them seemed to know anything about it. Went to the landlord, who's an accountant living on the ground floor, asked him if he could tell me what had become of the Red-Headed League. He said he'd never heard of any such body, and I asked him who Mr. Duncan Ross was, and he answered the name was new to him." "Well, shall I, the gentleman number 4?" What, the red-headed man? Yes, and oh, said he, his name was William Morris. He was a solicitor and was using my room as a temporary convenience until his new premises were ready. He moved out yesterday. And where could I find him? It was his new offices. He did tell me the address. 17 King Edward Street, near St. Paul's. I started off, Mr. Holmes, but when I got to that address, it was a manufactory of artificial kneecaps. No one in it had ever heard of Mr. William Morris or Duncan Ross either.
And what did you do then?
I went home to Sexcosbridge Square, and I took the advice of my assistant, but he couldn't help me in any way. He could only say that if I waited I should hear by post. But that was not quite good enough, Mr. Holmes. I did not wish to lose without a struggle. So I had heard you were good enough to give advice to poor folk who were in need of it, so I came right away to you.
And you did very wisely. Your case is an exceedingly remarkable one, and I shall be happy to look into it. From what you've told me, I think that it's possible that graver issues hang from it than might at first sight appear.
Grave enough? Why, I've lost £4 a week.
As far as you are personally concerned, remarked Holmes, I do not see that you have any grievance against this extraordinary league. On the contrary, you are, as I understand, richer by some £30, to say nothing of the minute knowledge which you have gained on every subject which comes under the letter A. You've lost nothing by them.
No, sir, but I want to find out about them and who they are, what their object was in playing this prank, if it was a prank upon me. It was a pretty expensive joke for them, for they cost them £32.
We shall endeavour to clear up these points for you. And first, one of two questions, Mr. Wilson. This assistant of yours who called your attention to the advertisement, how long had he been with you?
About a month.
How did he come?
In answer to an advertisement.
Was he the only applicant?
No, I had a dozen.
Why did you pick him?
He was handy and would come cheap.
At half wages, in fact.
Yes.
What's he like, this Vinted Spaulding?
Small, stout-built, very quick in his ways, no hair on his face, though he's not short of 30, has a white splash of acid upon his forehead.
Holmes sat up in the chair in considerable excitement. I thought as much. Have you ever observed that his ears are pierced for earrings?
Yes, sir. He told me that a traveller had done it for him when he was a lad.
Said Holmes, sinking back in deep thought. He's still with you?
Oh, yes, sir. I've only just left him.
And has your business been attended to in your absence?
Nothing to complain of, sir. There's nothing very much to do in the morning.
That will do, Mr. Wilson. I shall be happy to give you an opinion on the subject in the course of a day or two. Today is Saturday, and I hope that by Monday we may come to a conclusion. Well, Watson, said Holmes when our visitor had left us, what do you make of it all? I make nothing of it, I answered frankly. It's a most mysterious business. As a rule, the more bizarre a thing as a rule, the more bizarre a thing is, the less mysterious it proves to be. It is commonplace, featureless crimes which are really puzzling, just as a commonplace face is the most difficult to identify. But I must be prompt over this matter. What are you going to do, then? To smoke. It's quite a three-pipe problem, and I beg that you won't speak to me for 15 minutes. He curled himself up in his chair, with his thin knees drawn up to his hawk-like nose, and there he sat with his eyes closed and his black clay pipe thrusting out like the bill of some strange bird. I had come to the conclusion that he had dropped asleep, and indeed was starting to nod myself, when he suddenly sprang out of his chair with the gesture of a man who has made up his mind and put his pipe down upon the mantelpiece. "So a state plays at St. James' Hall this afternoon," he remarked. "What do you think, Watson? Could your patients spare you for a few hours?" "I have nothing to do today. My practice is never very absorbing." "Then put on your hat and come. I'm going to the city first, and we can have some lunch on the way. I observe there's a good deal of German music on the programme, which is rather more to my taste than the Italian or French. It's introspective. I wish to introspect. Come along." We travelled by the Underground as far as Aldersgate, and a short walk took us to Saxe-Coburg Square, the scene of the singular story which we'd listened to in the morning. It was a poky, little shabby, genteel place, where 4 lines of dingy, 2-storied brick houses looked out into a small, railed-in enclosure, where a lawn of weedy grass and a few lumps of faded laurel bushes made a hard fight against a smoke-laden and uncongenial atmosphere. 3 gilt balls and a brown board, with Jabez Wilson in white letters upon a corner house, announced the place where our red-headed client carried on his business. Sherlock Holmes stopped in the front of it, with his head on one side, and looked it all over, with his eyes shining brightly between puckered lids. Then he looked slowly up the street, and walked again down to the corner, still looking keenly at the houses. Finally he returned to the pawnbroker's, and having thumped vigorously upon the pavement with a stick 2 or 3 times, he went up to the door and knocked. It was instantly opened by a bright-looking, clean-shaven young fellow, who asked him to step in. "Thank you. I only wished to ask you how you would go from here to the Strand." "Third right, fourth left," answered the assistant promptly, closing the door. "Smart fellow, that," observed Holmes as he walked away. "He is, in my judgment, the 4th smartest man in London, and for daring I am not sure that he has not a claim to be 3rd. I've known something of him before." "Evidently," said I, "Mr. Wilson's assistant counts for a good deal in this mystery of the Red-Headed League. I'm sure you inquired your way merely in order that you might see him." "Not him." "What then?" "The knees of his trousers." "And what did you see?" "What I expected to see." "Why did you beat the pavement?" "My dear doctor, this is a time for observation, not for talk. We're spies in an enemy's country. We know something of Saxe-Coburg Square. Let us now explore the parts which lie behind it." The road in which we found ourselves as we turned round the corner from the retired Saxe-Coburg Square presented as great a contrast to it as the front of the picture does to the back. It was one of the main arteries which conveyed the traffic of the city north and west. The roadway was blocked with the immense stream of commerce flowing in a double tide inward and outward, while the footpaths were black with a hurrying swarm of pedestrians. It was difficult to realize as we looked at the line of fine shops and stately business premises that they really abutted on either side of the faded stagnant square which we had just quitted. "Let me see," said Holmes, standing at the corner and glancing along the line. "I should like to just remember the order of the houses here. It's a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London. There's Mortimer's, the tobacconist, the little newspaper shop, the Coburg branch of the City and Suburban Bank, the vegetarian restaurant, McFarland's carriage-building depot. That carries us right on to the other block. And now, doctor, we've done our work, so it's time we had some play. A sandwich, a cup of coffee, then off to the violin-land, where all its sweetness and delicacy and harmony, and there are no red-headed clients to vex us with their conundrums." My friend was an enthusiastic musician, being himself not only a very capable performer, but a composer of no ordinary merit. All the afternoon he sat in the stalls, wrapped in the most perfect happiness, gently waving his long, thin fingers in time to the music, while his gently smiling face and his languid, dreamy eyes were as unlike those of the Holmes the sleuth-hound, Holmes the relentless, keen-witted, ready-handed criminal agent, as it was possible to conceive. In his singular character, the dual nature alternately reasserted itself, and in his extreme exactness and astuteness was represented, as I often thought, the reaction against the poetic and contemplative mood which occasionally predominated in him. The swing of his nature took him from extreme languor to devouring energy, and as I knew well, he was never so truly formidable as when, for days on end, he had been seen lounging in his armchair amid his improvisations and black-letter editions. Then it was the lust of the chase which suddenly come upon him, and at his brilliant reasoning power it would rise to the level of intuition, until those who were unacquainted with his methods would look askance at him, as on a man whose knowledge was not that of other mortals. When I saw him that afternoon so enwrapped in the music at St. James's Hall, I felt that an evil time might be coming down upon those who had set himself to hunt down. "You want to go home, no doubt, doctor," he remarked as we emerged. "Yes, and we will. I have some business to do which will take some hours. This business at Coburg Square, it's serious." "Why serious?" "A considerable crime is in contemplation. I have every reason to believe that we shall be in time to stop it, but today being Saturday rather complicates matters. I shall want your help tonight." "At what time?" 10 will be nearly enough." "I shall be at Baker Street at 10. "Very well. And I say, doctor, there may be some little danger, so kindly put your army revolver in your pocket." He waved his hand, turned on his heel, and disappeared in an instant among the crowd. I trust that I'm not more dense than my neighbours, but I was always oppressed with a sense of my own stupidity in my dealings with Sherlock Holmes. Here I had heard what he had said, I had seen what he had seen, and yet from his words it was evident that he saw clearly not only what had happened, but what was about to happen. While to me the whole business was still confused and grotesque. As I drove home to my house in Kensington, I thought over it all, from the extraordinary story of the red-headed copier of the encyclopedia, down to the visit to the Saxe-Coburg Square, and the ominous words with which he had parted from me. What was this nocturnal expedition? Why should I go armed? Where were we going? What were we to do? I had the hint from Holmes that this smooth-faced pawnbroker's assistant was a formidable man, a man who might play a deep game. I tried to puzzle it out, but gave it up in despair, and set the matter aside until night should bring an explanation. It was 9:15 when I started from home and made my way across the park, and so through Oxford Street to the Baker Street. 2 hansoms were standing at the door. As I entered the passage, I heard the sound of voices from above. On entering his room, I found Holmes in an animated conversation with 2 men, one of whom I recognized as Peter Jones, the official police agent, while another was a long, thin, sad-faced man with a very shiny hat and oppressively respectable frock-coat. "Humph! Our party is complete," said Holmes, buttoning up his pea-jacket and taking his heavy hunting crop from the rack. "Watson, I think you know of Mr. Jones, of Scotland Yard. Let me introduce you to Mr. Merryweather, who's to be our companion in tonight's adventure." "We're hunting in couples again, Doctor, you see," said Jones in his consequential way. "Our friend here is a wonderful man for starting a chase. All he wants is an old dog to help him do the running down." "I hope a wild goose may not prove to be the end of our chase," observed Mr. Merryweather gloomily. You may place considerable confidence in Mr. Holmes, sir," said the police agent, loftily. "He has his own little methods, which, if you won't mind my saying so, just a little too theoretical and fantastic, but he has the makings of a detective in him. It is not too much to say that once or twice, as in that business of the Sholto murder and the Agra treasure, he's been more nearly correct than the official force." "Oh, if you say so, Mr. Jones, it is all right," said the stranger with deference. "Still, I confess that I miss my rubber. It's the first Saturday night for 27 years that I've not had my rubber." "I think you will find that you'll play for a higher stake tonight than you have ever done yet. The play will be much more exciting. For you, Mr. Merryweather, the stake will be some £30,000, and for you, Mr. Jones, it will be the man upon whom you wish to lay your hands." "John Clay, the murderer, the thief, smasher, and forger. He's a young man, Mr. Merryweather, but he's at the head of his profession, and I would rather have my bracelets on him than on any criminal in London. He's a remarkable man, is young John Clay. His grandfather was a royal duke, and he himself had been to Eton and Oxford. His brain is as cunning as his fingers, and though we meet signs of him every term, we never know where to find the man himself. He'll crack a crib in Scotland one week and be raising money to build an orphanage in Cornwall the next. I've been on his track for years, and I've never set eyes on him yet. I hope that I may have the pleasure of introducing him to 1 or 2 little turns with Mr. John Clay, and I agree with you that he's the head of his profession. It's past 10, however, and quite time that we started. If you 2 will take the first hansom, Watson and I will follow in the second." And Sherlock Holmes was not very communicative during the long drive, and lay back in the cab, humming the tunes which he'd heard that afternoon. We rattled through an endless labyrinth of gas-lit streets until we emerged into Farrington Street. We were close there now. This fellow Merryweather is a bank director, personally interested in the matter. I thought it as well to have Jones with us also. He's not a bad fellow, though an absolute imbecile in his profession. He has one positive virtue. He's as brave as a bulldog and as tenacious as a lobster, if he gets his claws upon anyone. Here they are, and they're waiting for us. We had reached the same crowded thoroughfare which we had found ourselves this morning. Our cabs were dismissed, and through the guidance of Merryweather, we passed down a narrow passage and through a side door which he opened for us. Within there was a small corridor which ended at a very massive iron gate. This was also opened, and led down a flight of winding stone steps, which terminated at another formidable gate. Mr. Merryweather stopped to light a lantern, then conducted us down a dark, earth-smelling passage, and so, after opening into a third door, into a huge vault or cellar which was piled all round with crates and massive boxes. "You are not very vulnerable from above," Holmes remarked as he held up the lantern and gazed about him. "Nor from below," said Merryweather, striking his stick upon the flags which lined the floor. "Dear me, it sounds quite hollow," he remarked, looking up in surprise. "I really must ask you to be a little more quiet," Holmes said severely. "You have already imperilled the whole success of our expedition. Might I beg that you would have the goodness to sit down upon one of those boxes, and not to interfere?" The solemn Mr. Merryweather perched himself upon a crate, with a very injured expression upon his face, while Holmes fell to his knees upon the floor, and with the lantern and a magnifying lens began to examine minutely the cracks between the stones. A few seconds sufficed to satisfy him, for he sprang to his feet and again put his glass in his pocket. "We have at least an hour before us, before they can hardly take any steps until the good pawnbroker is safely in bed. Then they will not lose a minute, for the sooner they do their work, the longer time they'll have their escape. We are at present, Doctor, as you no doubt have divined, in the cellar of the city branch of one of the principal London banks. Merryweather is the chairman of directors, and he will explain to you that there are reasons why the more daring criminals of London should take a considerable interest in this cellar at present." "It's our French gold," whispered the director. "We've had several warnings that an attempt might be made upon it." "Your French gold?" "Yes. We had occasion some months ago to strengthen our resources, and borrowed for that purpose 30,000 Napoleons from the Bank of France. It's become known that we've never had occasion to unpack the money still lying in our cellar. The crate upon which I sit contains 2,000 Napoleons packed between layers of lead foil. Our reserve of bullion is much larger at present than is usually kept in a single branch office. The directors have had misgivings upon the subject." "Which were very well justified. And now it is time that we arranged our little plans. I expect that within an hour matters will come to a head. In the meantime, Mr. Merryweather, we must put the screen over that dark lantern." "And sit in the dark?" "I'm afraid so. I had brought a pack of cards in my pocket, and I thought that, as we were partie carré, you might have your rubber after all, but I see that the enemy's preparations have gone so far we can't risk the presence of a light. And first of all we must choose our positions. These are daring men, and though we shall take them at a disadvantage, they may do us some harm unless we're careful. I shall stand behind this crate, and you shall conceal yourselves behind those. Then when I flash a light upon them, close in swiftly. If they fire, Watson, have no compunction about shooting them down." And I placed my revolver cocked up on top of the wooden case behind which I crouched. Holmes shot the slide crown of his lantern and left us in pitch darkness. Such an absolute darkness I've never before experienced. The smell of hot metal remained to assure us that the light was still there, ready to flash out at a moment's notice. To me, with my nerves worked up to a pitch of expectancy, there was something depressing and subduing in the sudden gloom and the cold, dank air of the vault. "They have but one retreat, that is through the house back into Saxe-Coburg Square. I hope that you've done what I asked you, Jones?" "I have an inspector and 2 officers waiting at the front door. Then we have stopped all the holes. Now we must be silent and wait." And what a time it seemed! From comparing notes afterward, it was but an hour and a quarter, but it appeared to me that the night must have almost gone and the dawn be breaking above us. My limbs were weary and stiff, for I feared to change my position, and yet my nerves were worked up to the highest pitch of tension, and my hearing was so acute that I could not only hear the gentle breathing of my companions, but I could distinguish the deeper, heavier in-breath of the bulky Jones from the thin, sighing note of the bank director. From my position, I could look over in the case at the direction of the floor, and suddenly my eyes caught the glint of a light. Alright, at this point, folks, we're going to take our intermission. Now would be a good time to get up, stretch if you've been sitting still this whole time, drink some water, have some food if you have calories left in the day. I'm going to be right back, and we will return finding out just what the heck is the deal with this light. See you guys then. Okay, welcome back from the intermission. I hope you all had a nice little momentary break there. Let's pick back up, shall we? At first it was but a lurid spark upon the stone of pavement, and then it lengthened out until it became a yellow line, and then without any warning or sound, a gash seemed to open and a hand appeared, a white, almost womanly hand, which felt about in the center of the little area of light. For a minute or more the hand with its writhing fingers protruded out of the floor, and it was withdrawn as suddenly as it appeared, and all was dark again save the single lurid spark which marked a chink between the stones. Its disappearance, however, was but momentary. With a rending, tearing sound, one of the broad white stones turned over upon its side and left a square, gaping hole, through which streamed the light of the lantern. Over the edge there peeped a clean-cut, boyish face, which looked keenly about it, and then with a hand on either side of the aperture drew itself shoulder-high and waist-high, until one knee rested upon the edge. In another instant he stood at the side of the hole, and was hauling after him a companion, lithe and small like himself, with a pale face and a shock of red hair. "It's all clear," he whispered. "Have you the chisel and the bags?" "Great Scott! Jump, Archie, jump, and I'll swing for it." Holmes had sprung out and seized the intruder by the collar. The other dived down the hole, and I heard the sound of rending cloth as Jones clutched at his skirts. The light flashed upon the barrel of a revolver, but Holmes's hunting crop came down on the man's wrist, and the pistol clinked onto the stone floor. "It's no use, John Clay. You have no chance at all." "So I see," the other answered with utmost coolness. "I fancy that my pal's all right, though I see you've got his coat-tails." "There are 3 men waiting for him at the door." "Oh, indeed. You seem to have done the thing very completely. I must compliment you." "And I you. Your red-headed idea was very new and effective." "You'll see your pal again presently. He's quicker at climbing down holes than I am. Just hold out while I fix the derbies." "I beg that you will not touch me with your filthy hands," remarked our prisoner as the handcuffs clattered upon his wrists. "You may not be aware that I have royal blood in my veins. Have the goodness also, when you address me, to always say sir and please." "All right," said Jones with a stare and a chuckle. "Would you please, sir, march upstairs? We can get a cab to carry your highness to the police station." "That's better," said John Clay serenely. He made a sweeping bow to the 3 of us and walked off in the custody of the detective. "Really, Mr. Holmes," said Merryweather as we followed them from the cellar, "I did not know how the bank can thank you or repay you. There's no doubt you've detected and defeated in the most complete manner one of the most determined attempts at bank robbery that have ever come within my experience." "I have had 1 or 2 little scores of my own to settle with Mr. John Clay," said Holmes. "I've been at some small expense over this matter, which I shall expect the bank to refund, but beyond that I am amply repaid by simply having had an experience which is in many ways unique, and by hearing the very remarkable narrative of the Red-Headed League. You see, Watson," he explained in early hours of the morning as we sat over a glass of whiskey and soda in Baker Street, "it was perfectly obvious from the first that the only possible object of this rather fantastic business of the advertisement of the League and the copying of the encyclopedia must be to get this not-over-bright pawnbroker out of the way for a number of hours every day, but it was a curious way of managing it. Really, it would be difficult to suggest a better one, however. The method was no doubt suggested by Clay's ingenious mind by the colour of his accomplice's hair. The £4 a week was a lure which must draw him, and what was it to them, who were paying for thousands? They put in the advertisement, one rogue has the temporary office, another rogue incites the man to apply for it, and together they managed to secure his absence every morning in the week. For in that time I heard the assistant having come for half wages. Well, it was obvious to me that he had some strong motive for securing the situation." "But how could you guess what the motive was? Had there been women in the house, I should have suspected a more vulgar intrigue. That, however, was out of the question. The man's business was a small one, and there was nothing in his house which could elaborate such preparations, and such an expenditure that they were at as well. Yes, it must then be something out of the house. What could it be? I thought of the assistant's fondness for photography and his trick of vanishing into the cellar. The cellar! There was the end of this tangled clue. Then I made inquiries as to the mysterious assistant, and I found that I had to deal with one of the coolest and most daring criminals in London. He was doing something in the cellar, something which took many hours upon a day for months on end. What could it be, once more? I could think of nothing save that he was running a tunnel to some other building. So far I had got when we went to visit the scene of the action. I surprised you by beating upon the pavement with my stick. I was ascertaining whether the cellar stretched out in front or behind. It was not in front, and then I rang the bell as I'd hoped. The assistant answered it. We've had some skirmishes, but we've never set eyes upon each other before. I hardly looked at his face. His knees were what I wished to see. You must have yourself remarked how worn, wrinkled, and stained they were. They spoke of those hours of burrowing. The only remaining point was what they were burrowing for. I walked round the corner, saw the City and Suburban Bank abutted our friend's premises, and felt that I had solved my problem. When you drove home after the concert, I called upon Scotland Yard and upon the chairman of the bank directors, with the result that you've seen. And how could you tell that they'd make their attempt tonight? Well, when they closed their league offices, it was a sign they no longer cared about Mr. Jarvis Wilson's presence. In other words, they'd completed their tunnel. But it was essential that they should use it soon. It might be discovered, the bullion might be removed. Saturday would suit them better than any other day. It would give them 2 days for their escape. For all these reasons I expected them to come tonight. You reasoned it out beautifully, I exclaimed in unfeigned admiration. It's so long a chain, and yet every link rings true. It saved me from ennui, he answered, yawning. Alas, I already felt it closing in upon me. My life is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplaces of existence. These little problems help me to do so. And you're a benefactor of the race. And he shrugged his shoulders. Well, perhaps after all it is of some little use. L'homme s'instruit au lieu vieux s'estot, as Gustave Flaubert wrote to George Sand. I don't speak French, and I don't speak any languages adjacent to French. So that's probably not going to be very good pronunciation. Have fun with that, people who speak French. Adventure 3, A Case of Identity. My dear fellow, said Holmes as we sat on either side of the fire in his lodgings at Baker Street, life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent. We wouldn't dare to conceive the things which are really mere commonplaces of existence. If we could fly out of that window hand in hand, hover over this great city, gently remove the roofs, and peep in at the strange things which are going on, the strange coincidences, the plannings, the cross-purposes, the wonderful chains of events working through generations, and leading to the most outre results, it would make fiction with its conventionalities and unforeseen conclusions most stale and unprofitable. And yet I'm not convinced of it. The cases which come to light in the papers are, as a rule, bald enough and vulgar enough. We have in our police reports realism pushed to its extreme limits, and yet the result is, it must be confessed, neither fascinating nor artistic. A certain selection and discretion must be used in producing a realistic effect. This is wanting in the police report, where more stress is laid, perhaps, upon the platitudes of the magistrate than upon the details, to which an observer contains the vital efforts of the whole matter. Depend upon it, there's no thing so unnatural as the commonplace. I smiled and shook my head. I can quite understand your thinking so. Of course, in your position of unofficial advisor and helper to everybody who's absolutely puzzled throughout 3 continents, you're brought in contact with all this strange and bizarre, but here, I picked up the morning paper from the ground. Let us put it to a practical test. Here's the first heading upon which I come. A husband's cruelty to his wife. There's a half-column of print, but I know without reading that it's all perfectly familiar to me. There's, of course, the other woman, the drink, the push, the blow, the bruise, the sympathetic sister or landlady. The crudest of writers could invent nothing more crude. Indeed, your example is an unfortunate one for your argument, said Holmes, taking the paper and glancing his eye down it. This is the Dundas separation case, and as it happens I was engaged in clearing up some small points in connection with it. The husband was a teetotaler. There was no other woman. The conduct complained of was that he had drifted into the habit of winding up every meal by taking out his false teeth and hurling them at his wife, which, you will allow, is not an action likely to occur to the imagination of the average storyteller. Take a pinch of snuff, Doctor, and acknowledge that I scored over you in your example. He held out a snuff-box of old gold with a great amethyst in the center of the lid. Its splendor was in such contrast to his homely ways and simple life that I couldn't help commenting upon it. "Ah, I forgot that I hadn't seen you for some weeks. It's a little souvenir from the King of Bohemia, in return for my assistance in the case of the Irene Adler papers." "And the ring?" I asked, glancing at a remarkable brilliant which sparkled upon his finger. Is brilliant a type of gem? Let's find out. Because that sounds... Brilliant gem. A brilliant... Oh, it's just a... Oh, so it's the brilliant cut is the standard cut for a diamond. So when they refer to it as a brilliant, it is in fact a diamond. It was from the reigning family of Holland, though the manner in which I served them was of such delicacy I cannot confide it even to you, who have been good enough to chronicle one or two of my little problems. And have you any on hand just now? Some 10 or 12, but none which present any feature of interest. They're important, you understand, without being interesting. Indeed, I've found that it's usually in unimportant matters that there is a field for observation, for the quick analysis of cause and effect which gives the charm to the investigation. The larger crimes are apt to be the simpler, for the bigger the crime, the more obvious, as a rule, is the motive. In these cases, save for one rather intricate matter which has been referred to me from Marseille, there's nothing which presents any features of interest. It's possible, however, that I may have something better before many minutes are over, for this is one of my clients, or I am much mistaken." He had risen from his chair and was standing between the parted blinds, gazing down into the dull, neutral-tinted London street. Looking over his shoulder, I saw that on the pavement opposite there stood a large woman with a heavy fur boa around her neck, and a large curling red feather in a broad-brimmed hat which was tilted in a coquettish Duchess of Devonshire fashion over her ear. From this great panoply she peeped up in a nervous, hesitating fashion at our windows, while her body oscillated backward and forward, and her fingers fidgeted with the glove buttons. Suddenly, with a plunge, as of the swimmer who leaves the bank, she hurried across the road, and we heard the sharp clang of the bell. "I've seen those symptoms before," Holmes said, throwing his cigarette into the fire. "Oscillation upon the pavement always means an affaire de cure. She would like advice, but is not sure that the matter is not too delicate for communication. And yet even here we may discriminate. When a woman has been seriously wronged by a man, she no longer oscillates, and the usual symptom is a broken bell wire. Here we may take it that there is a love matter, but that the maiden is not so much angry as perplexed or grieved. But here she comes in person to resolve our doubts." As he spoke, there was a tap at the door, and the boy in buttons entered to announce Miss Mary Sutherland, while the lady herself loomed behind a small black figure like a full-sailed merchantman behind a tiny pilot-boat. Sherlock Holmes welcomed her with the easy courtesy for which he was remarkable, and having closed the door and bowed her into an armchair, he looked her over in the minute and yet abstracted fashion which was peculiar to him. "Do you not find that with your short sight it's a little trying to do such typewriting?" "I did at first," she answered, "but now I know where the letters are without looking." And then, suddenly realizing the full purport of his words, she gave a violent start and looked up with fear and astonishment upon her broad, good-humoured face. "You've heard about me, Mr. Holmes. How else could you know all that?" "Never mind that," said Holmes, laughing. "It's my business to know things. Perhaps I've trained myself to see what others overlook. If not, why should you come to consult me?" "I came to you, sir, because I heard of you from Miss Etheridge, whose husband you found so easily when the police and everyone had given him up for dead. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I wish you would do as much for me. I'm not rich, but I still have 100 a year in my own right, besides the little that I make by the machine, and I would give it all to know what has become of Mr. Holmes, Sir Angel." "Why did you come to consult me in such a way, and in such a hurry?" asked Holmes, with his fingertips together and his eyes to the ceiling. Again a startled look came over the somewhat vacuous face of Miss Mary Sutherland. "Yes, I did bang out of the house, for it made me angry to see the easy way in which Mr. Windybank, that is, my father, took it all. He wouldn't go to the police, and he wouldn't go to you, so at last, as he would do nothing, and kept on saying there was no harm done, it made me mad, and I just on with my things and right away to you." "Your father, your stepfather, surely, since the name is different." Yes, my stepfather. I call him father, though it sounds funny, for he's only 5 years and 2 months older than myself.
And your mother is alive?
Oh, yes, mother is alive and well. I wasn't best pleased, Mr. Holmes, when she married again so soon after father's death, a man who was nearly 15 years younger than herself. Father was a plumber in the Tottenham Court Road, and he left a tidy business behind him, which mother carried on with Mr. Hardy, the foreman, but when Mr. Windybank came, he made her sell the business, for he was very superior, being a traveller in wines. They got £4,700 for the goodwill and interest, which wasn't near as much as father could have got if he'd been alive. I had expected to see Sherlock Holmes impatient under this rambling and inconsequential narrative, but on the contrary he listened with the greatest concentration of attention.
Your own little income, does it come out of the business?
Oh, no, sir, it's quite separate. It was left to me by my Uncle Ned in Auckland. It's New Zealand stock, paying 4.5%. £2,500 was the amount, but I can only touch the interest.
You interest me extremely, and since you draw so large a sum as 100 a year, with what you earn into the bargain, you no doubt travel a little and indulge yourself in every way. I believe that a single lady can get on very nicely upon an income of about £60.
I could do with much less than that, Mr. Holmes, but you understand, as long as I live at home, I don't wish to be a burden to them, so they have the use of the money just while I'm staying with them. Of course, that's only just for the time. Mr. Windybank draws my interest every quarter and pays it over to my mother, and I find I can do pretty well with what I earn at typewriting. Brings me 2 pence a sheet, and I can often do 15 to 20 sheets in a day.
You've made your position very clear to me. This is my friend, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself.
Kindly tell us now all about your connection with Mr. Hosmer Angel.
A flush stole over Sutherland's face, and she picked nervously at the fringe of her jacket.
I met him first at the gasfitters' ball. They used to send father's tickets when he was alive. Afterwards they remembered us and sent them to mother. Mr. Windybank didn't wish us to go. He never did wish us to go anywhere. He would get quite mad if I wanted to go so much as join a Sunday school treat. But this time I was set on going, and I would go, for what right had he to prevent me? He said the folk were not fit for us to know, when all father's friends were to be there, and he said that I had nothing fit to wear when I had my purple plush that I had never so much as taken out of the drawer. At last, when nothing else would do, he went off to France upon the business of the firm, but when we went, mother and I, with Mr. Hardy, who used to be our foreman, it was there that I met Mr. Hosmer Angel.
I suppose that when Mr. Windybank came back from France he was very annoyed at your having gone to the ball.
Oh, well, he was very good about it. He laughed, I remember, and shrugged his shoulders, and said there was no use denying anything for a woman, since she'd have her way.
I see. That at the gasfitters' ball you met, as I understand, a gentleman called Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Yes, sir. I met him that night, and he called next day to ask if we had got home all safe, and after that we met him, that is to say, Mr. Holmes, I met him twice for walks, but after that father came back again, and Mr. Hosmer Angel couldn't come to the house any more.
No?
Well, you know father didn't like anything of the sort. He wouldn't have any visitors if he could help it, and he used to say that a woman should be happy in her own family circle. But then, as I used to say to mother, a woman who wants her own circle to begin with, and I had not gotten mine yet.
But how about Mr. Hosmer Angel? Did he make no attempt to see you?
Well, father was going off to France again in a week, and Hosmer wrote and said it would be safer and better not to see each other until he'd gone. We could write in the meantime, and he used to write every day. I took letters in the morning, so there was no need for father to know.
Were you engaged to the gentleman at this time?
Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes, we were engaged. After the first walk that we took, Hosmer, Mr. Angel, was a cashier in an office in Leadenhall Street, and
what office?
That's the worst of it, Mr. Holmes, I don't know.
Where did he live, then?
He slept on the premises.
And you don't know his address?
No, except that it was Leadenhall Street.
Where did you address your letters, then?
To the Leadenhall Street post office, to be left until called for. He said if they were sent to the office he'd be chaffed by all the other clerks about having letters from a lady. I offered to typewrite them like he did his, but he wouldn't have that, for he said that when he wrote them, they always seemed to come from me, but when they were typewritten he always felt the machine had come between us. That'll just show you how fond he was of me, Mr. Holmes, and the little things he would think of it.
It was most suggestive.
It's long been an axiom of mine that the little things are infinitely the most important. Can you remember any other little things, about Mr. Hosmer Angel? He was a very shy man, Mr. Holmes. He would rather walk with me in the evening than in the daylight, for he said that he hated to be conspicuous. Very retiring and gentlemanly he was. Even his voice was gentle. He had the quinsy and swollen glands when he was young, he told me, and it left him with a weak throat and a hesitating, whispering fashion of speech. He was always well dressed, very neat and plain, but his eyes were weak, just as mine are, and he wore tinted glasses against the glare. Well, and what happened when Mr. Windybank, your stepfather, returned to France? Mr. Hosmer Angel came to the house again and proposed that we should marry before father came back. He was in dreadful earnest, and made me swear, with my hands on the testament, that whatever happened I would always be true to him. Mother said he was quite right to make me swear. That was a sign of his passion. Mother was all in favour from the first, even fonder of him than I was. Then, when they talked of marrying within the week, I began to ask about father, but they both said never mind it, father, but to tell him afterwards, and mother said she would make it all right with him. I didn't quite like that, Mr. Holmes. It seemed funny that I should ask his leave, as he was only a few years older than me, but I didn't want to do anything on the sly, so I wrote to father at Bordeaux, where the company has its French offices, but the letter came back to me on the very morning of the wedding. It missed him, then? Yes, sir, for he'd started to England just before it arrived. That was unfortunate. Your wedding was arranged, then, for the Friday. Was it to be in church? Yes, sir, but very quietly. It was to be at St. Saviour's, near King's Cross. We were to have breakfast afterward at the St. Pancras Hotel. Hosmer came for us in a hansom, but as there were two of us, he put us both into it and stepped himself into a four-wheeler, which happened to be the only other cab in the street. We got to the church first, and when the four-wheeler drove up, we waited for him to step out, but he never did, and when the cabman got down from the box and looked, there was no one there. The cabman said he couldn't imagine what had become of him, for he'd seen him get in with his own eyes. That was last Friday, Mr. Holmes, and I've never seen or heard anything since then to throw any light on what became of him. It seems to me that you've been very shamefully treated. Oh, no, sir, he was good and kind to leave me so. All the morning he was saying to me that, whatever happened, I was to be true, and that if there was something quite unforeseen happened to separate us, I was always to remember that I was pledged to him, that he would claim his pledge sooner or later. It seems strange talk for a wedding morning, but what's happened since certainly gives a meaning to it. Most certainly it does. Your opinion is, then, that some unforeseen catastrophe has occurred to him? Yes, sir. I believe that he foresaw some danger, or else he would not have talked so, and I think what he foresaw had happened. But you have no notion as to what it could have been? None. One more question. How did your mother take the matter? She was angry, and she said that I was never to speak of the matter again. And your father, did you tell him? Yes, and he seemed to think that with me that something had happened, that I should hear of Hosmer again. And he said, what could interest anyone have in bringing me to the doors of a church and then leaving me? Now, if he had borrowed my money, or if he had married me and gotten my money settled on him, there might be some reason. But Hosmer was very independent about money. He never took a shilling of mine. Yet what could have happened? Why would he not write? Oh, it drives me half mad to think of it. I can't sleep a wink at night. She pulled a little handkerchief out of her muff and began to sob heavily into it. I shall glance into the case for you, and I have no doubt that we shall reach some definite result. Let the weight of the matter rest upon me now. Do not let your mind dwell upon it further. Above all, try to let Mr. Hosmer Angel vanish from your memory, as he's done from your life. Then you don't think I'll see him again? I fear not. Then what's happened to him? You leave that question in my hands. I would like an accurate description of him in any letters of his which you can spare. I advertised him in last Saturday's Chronicle. Here's the slip, and here are 4 letters from him. Thank you. And your address? Number 31 Lion Place, Camberwell. Mr. Angel's address you never had, understand. Was your father's place of business? He travels for Westhouse and Marbank, the great claret importers of Fenchurch Street. Thank you. You've made your statement very clearly. You'll leave the papers here, and remember the advice which I have given you. Let the whole incident be a sealed book. Do not allow it to affect your life. You're very kind, Mr. Holmes, but I can't do that. I shall be true to Hosmer. You'll find me ready when he comes back. For all the preposterous hat and vacuous face, there was something noble in the simple faith of our visitor which had compelled our respect. She laid her little bundle of papers upon the table and went upon her way, with a promise to come again whenever she might be summoned. Sherlock Holmes sat silent for a few minutes, with his hands pressed together, his legs stretched out in front of him, and his gaze directed upward to the ceiling. Then he took down from the rack an old and oily clay pipe, which was to him as a counsellor, and having lit it, he leaned back in his chair with a thick blue cloud wreath spinning up from him, and a look of infinite languor in his face. "Quite an interesting study, that maiden," he observed. "I found her more interesting than her little problem, which, by the way, is a rather trite one. You'll find parallel cases if you consult my index in Andover in '77, and there was something of the sort at the Hog last year. Old as is the idea, there were one or two details which are new to me, but the maiden herself was most instructive." "You appeared to read a good deal upon her, which was quite invisible to me." "Not invisible, but unnoticed, Watson. You didn't know where to look, and so you missed all that was important. I can never bring you to realize the importance of sleeves, the suggestiveness of thumbnails, or the great issues that may hang from a bootlace. Now, what did you gather from that woman's appearance? Describe it." "Well, she had a slate-colored, broad-brimmed straw hat, feather of brickish red. Her jacket was black beads sewn upon it, and a fringe of little jet black ornaments. Her dress was brown, rather darker than coffee color, with a little purplish plush at the neck and sleeves. Her gloves were grayish and were worn through with the right forefinger. Her boots I didn't observe. She had small, round, hanging gold earrings, and a general air of being fairly well-to-do in a vulgar, comfortable, easy-going way." Sherlock Holmes clapped his hands softly together and chuckled. "Upon my word, Watson, you're coming along very wonderfully. You've really done very well indeed. It's true that you've missed everything of importance, but you've hit upon the method, and you've a quick eye for colour. Never trust to general impressions, my boy, but concentrate yourself upon details. My first glance is always at a woman's sleeve. In a man it's perhaps better first to take the knee of the trouser. As you observe, this woman had plush upon her sleeves, which is most useful material for showing traces. The double line a little above the wrist where the typewriter presses against the table was beautifully defined. The sewing machine of the hand type leaves a similar mark, but only on the left arm, and the side farthest of it from the thumb, instead of being right across the broadest part, as this was. I then glanced at her face, and observing the dint of a pince-nez at either side of her nose, ventured a remark upon short sight and typewriting, which seemed to surprise her. Well, it surprised me. But surely it was obvious. I was then much surprised and interested on glancing down to observe that, though the boots she was wearing were not unlike each other, they were really odd ones, the one having a slightly decorated toe-cap, and the other a plain one. One was buttoned only in 2 lower buttons out of 5, and the other the first, third, and fifth. Now, when you see that a young lady otherwise neatly dressed has come away from home with odd boots half-buttoned, it's no great deduction to say that she came away in a great hurry." "And what else?" I asked, keenly interested, as I always was, by my friend's incisive reasoning. "I noted in passing that she'd written a note before leaving home, but after being fully dressed. You observed that the right glove was torn at the forefinger, but you didn't apparently see that both the glove and finger were stained with violet ink. She'd written in a hurry and dipped her pen too deep. It must have been the morning, or the mark would not remain clear upon the finger. All this is amusing, though rather elementary, but I must go back to business, Watson. Would you mind reading me the advertised description of Mr. Hosmer Angel?" I held the little printed slip to the light. "Missing, on the morning of the 15th, a gentleman named Hosmer Angel, about 5'7" in height, strongly built, sallow complexion, black hair, a little bald in the centre, bushy black side whiskers and moustache, tinted glasses, slight infirmity of speech, was dressed when last seen in black frock coat faced with silk, black waistcoat, gold Albert chain, and grey Harris tweed trousers with brown gaiters over elastic-sided boots. Known to have been employed in an office in Leadenhall Street. Anybody bringing? That'll do. As to the letters," he continued, glancing over them, "they're very commonplace, absolutely no clue in them to Mr. Angel, save that he quotes Balzac once. There's one remarkable point which you'll find that will no doubt strike you. They're typewritten. Not only that, but the signature is typewritten. Look at the neat little Hosmer Angel at the bottom. There's a date, you see, but no superscription, except Leadenhall Street, which is rather vague. The point about the signature is it's very suggestive. In fact, we may call it conclusive. Of what? My dear fellow, is it possible you do not see how strongly it bears upon the case? I cannot say that I do, unless it were that he wished to be able to deny his signature if an action for breach of promise were instituted. No, that was not the point. However, I shall write 2 letters, one which should settle the matter. One is to a firm in the city, the other to the young lady's stepfather, Mr. Windybank, asking him whether he could meet us here at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. It's just as well that we should do business with the male relatives. And now, Doctor, we can do nothing until the answers to those letters come, so we may put our little problem upon the shelf for the interim. I had so many reasons to believe in my friend's subtle powers of reasoning and extraordinary energy in action that I felt he must have had some solid grounds for the assured and easy demeanour with which he treated the singular mystery which had been called upon to fathom. Once only I had known him to fail, in the case of the King of Bohemia and of the Irene Adler photograph, but when I looked back to the weird business of the sign of 4 and the extraordinary circumstances connected with the study in scarlet, I felt that it would be a strange tangle indeed which he could not unravel. I left him then, still puffing at his black clay pipe, with the conviction that when I came again on the next evening, I would find that he held in his hands all the clues which led up to the identity of the disappearing bridegroom of Miss Mary Sutherland. A professional case of great gravity was engaging my own attention at the time, and the whole of the next day I was busy at the bedside of the sufferer. It was not until close upon 6 o'clock that I found myself free, and was able to spring into a hansom and drive to Baker Street, half afraid that I might be too late to assist at the denouement of the little mystery. I found Sherlock Holmes alone, however, half asleep, with his long, thin form curled up in the recesses of his armchair. A formidable array of bottles and test tubes, with a pungent, cleanly smell of hydrochloric acid, told me that he had spent his day in the chemical work which was so dear to him. "Well, have you solved it?" I asked as I entered. "Yes, it was the bisulfate of baryta." No, the mystery. Oh, that! I thought of the salt I've been working upon. There was never any mystery in the matter, though, as I said yesterday. Some of the details are of interest. The only drawback is there's no law, I fear, that can touch the scoundrel. Who was he, then, and what was his object in deserting Miss Sutherland? The question was hardly out of my mouth, and Holmes had not yet opened his lips to reply, when we heard a heavy footfall in the passage and a tap at the door. "This is the girl's stepfather, Mr. James Windybank," said Holmes. "He's written to me to say that he'd be here at 6. Come in." The man who entered was a sturdy, middle-sized fellow, some 30 years of age, clean-shaven and sallow-skinned, with a bland, insinuating manner, and a pair of wonderfully sharp and penetrating grey eyes. He shot a questioning glance at each of us, placed his shiny top hat upon the sideboard, and with a slight bow sidled down into the nearest chair. "Good evening, Mr. James Windybank. I think that this typewritten letter is from you, in which you made an appointment with me for 6 o'clock. "Yes, sir. I'm afraid that I'm a little late, but I'm not quite my own master, you know. I'm sorry that Miss Sutherland's troubled you about this little matter, for I think it's far better not to wash linen of this sort in public. It was quite against my wishes that she came, but she's a very excitable, impulsive girl, you may have noticed. She's not easily controlled when she's made her mind up on a point. Of course, I didn't mind you so much. You're not connected with the official police, but it's not pleasant to have a family misfortune like this noised abroad. Besides, it's a useless expense, for how could you possibly find this Hosmer Angel? On the contrary, I have every reason to believe that I will succeed in discovering Mr. Hosmer Angel." Mr. Windybank gave a violent start and dropped his gloves. "I'm delighted to hear it. It's a curious thing that a typewriter really has quite as much individuality as a man's handwriting. Unless they're quite new, no 2 of them write exactly alike. Some letters get more worn than others, and some wear only on one side. Now, as you remark in this note of yours, Mr. Windybank, in every case there's some little slurring over of the E and a slight defect in the tail of the R. There are 14 other characteristics, but those are the more obvious."
We do all our correspondence with this machine at the office. No doubt it's a little worn," our visitor answered, glancing keenly at Holmes with his bright little eyes. "Now I'll show you what is really a very interesting study, Mr. Windybank. I think of writing another little monograph some of these days on the typewriter, and its relation to crime. It's a subject to which I've devoted some little attention. I have here 4 letters which purport to come from the missing man. They are all typewritten. In each case, not only are all the E's slurred and the R's tailless, but you will observe, if you care to use my magnifying lens, 14 other characteristics to which I have alluded are there as well." Mr. Windybank sprang out of his chair and picked up his hat. "I cannot waste time over this sort of fantastic talk, Mr. Holmes. If you can catch the man, catch him, and let me know when you have done it."
"Certainly," said Holmes, stepping over and turning the key in the door. "I'll let you know, then, that I caught him."
"What? Where?"
shouted Windybank, turning white to his lips and glancing about him like a rat in a trap. "Oh, it won't do, really it won't. There's no possible getting out of it, Mr. Windybank. It's quite too transparent. It was a very bad compliment when you said that it was impossible for me to solve so simple a question. That's right. Sit down. Let us talk it over." Our visitor collapsed into a chair with a ghastly face and a glitter of moisture on his brow.
"It's not actionable."
"I'm very much afraid that it's not. But between ourselves, Mr. Windybank, it's as cruel and selfish and heartless a trick, in a petty way, as never came before me. Now let me just run over the course of events. You contradict me if I go wrong." The man sat huddled up in his chair, with his head sunk upon his chest like one is utterly crushed. Holmes stuck his feet up on the corner of the mantelpiece, and leaning back with his hands in his pockets, began talking, rather to himself, as it seemed, than to us. The man married a woman very much older than himself for her money, and he enjoyed the use of the money of the daughter as long as she lived with him. It was a considerable sum for the people in their position, and the loss of it would have made a serious difference. It was worth an effort to preserve it. The daughter was of a good, amiable disposition, but affectionate and warm-hearted in her ways, so that it was evident that with her fair personal advantages and her little income she would not be allowed to remain single long. Now her marriage would mean, of course, the loss of the 100 a year, and so what does a stepfather do to prevent it? He takes the obvious course of keeping her at home and forbidding her to seek the company of people her own age. But soon he found that she would not answer forever. She became restive, insisted upon her rights, and finally announced her positive intention of going to a certain ball. What does her clever stepfather do then? He conceives an idea more creditable to his head than to his heart. With the connivance and assistance of his wife, he disguised himself, covered those keen eyes with tinted glasses, masked his face with a moustache and a pair of bushy whiskers, sunk that clear voice into an insinuating whisper, and doubly secure on the count of the girl's short sight, he appears as Mr. Hosmer Angel, and keeps off other lovers by making love himself. It was only a joke at first. We never thought she'd been so carried away. Very likely not. However that may be, the young lady was decidedly very carried away, and having quite made up her mind that her stepfather was in France, the suspicion of treachery never for an instant entered her mind. She was flattered by the gentleman's attentions, and the effect increased by the loudly expressed admiration of her mother. Then Mr. Angel began to call, for it was obvious that the matter should be pushed as far as it would go if a real effect were to be produced. There were meetings and an engagement, which would finally secure the girl's affections from turning toward anyone else. But then the deception could not be kept up forever. The pretended journeys to France were rather cumbrous. The thing to do clearly was to bring the business to the end in such a dramatic manner that it would leave a permanent impression upon the young lady's mind, and prevent her from looking upon any other suitor for some time to come. Hence those vows of fidelity exacted upon a testament, and hence also the allusions to a possibility of something happening on the very morning of the wedding. James Windybank wished Miss Sutherland to be bound to Hosmer Angel, and so uncertain as to his fate that for 10 years to come, at any time, she would listen to another man. As far as the church door he brought her, and then, as he could go no farther, he conveniently vanished away by the old trick of stepping in one door of a four-wheeler and out at the other. I think that was the chain of events, Mr. Windybank. Our visitor had recovered something of his assurance while Holmes had been talking, and he rose from his chair now with a cold sneer upon his face. "It may be so, or it may not, Mr. Holmes, but if you are so very sharp, you ought to be sharp enough to know that it is you who are breaking the law now, and not me. I've done nothing actionable from the first, but as long as you keep that door locked, you lay yourself open to an action for assault and illegal constraint." "The law cannot, as you say, touch you," Holmes said, unlocking and throwing open the door. "Yet there never was a man who deserved punishment more. If the young lady has a brother or a friend, he ought to lay a whip across your shoulders. By Jove!" he continued, flushing up at the sight of the bitter sneer upon the man's face. "It's not part of my duties to my client, but here's a hunting crop handy. I think I shall treat myself to—" He took 2 swift steps to the whip, but before he could grasp it there was a wild clatter of steps upon the stairs, the heavy hall door banged, and from the window we could see Windybank running at the top of his speed down the road. "There's a cold-blooded scoundrel," said Holmes, laughing as he threw himself into his chair once more. "The fellow will rise from crime to crime until he does something very bad and ends on a gallows. His case has, in some respects, not been entirely devoid of interest." "I cannot now entirely see all the steps of your reasoning," I remarked. "Well, of course, it was obvious from the first that this Mr. Hosmer Angel must have some strong object for his curious conduct, and it was equally clear that the old man really profited by the incident, as far as we could see, was the stepfather. And, well, the fact that the 2 men were never together, but the one always appeared when the other was away, was so suggestive. So the tinted spectacles and the curious voice, which both hinted at as a disguise, as did the bushy whiskers. My suspicions were all confirmed by his peculiar action in typewriting his signature, which inferred that his handwriting was so familiar to her that she would have recognized even the smallest sample of it. You see, all these isolated facts, together with so many minor ones, all pointed in the same direction." "And how did you verify them?" "Having once spotted my man, it was easy to get corroboration. I knew for the firm which the man worked. Having taken the printed description, I eliminated everything from it which could be the result of a disguise. Whiskers, glasses, voice, and I sent it to the firm, with a request that they would inform me whether it answered the description of any of their travellers. I had already noticed the peculiarities of the typewriter. I wrote to the man himself at his place of business, asking him if he would come here. As expected, his reply was typewritten, and revealed the same trivial but characteristic defects. The same post brought to me a letter from Westhouse and Marbank of Fenchurch Street, to say that the description tallied in every respect of their employee, James Windybank. Voilà tout. And Miss Sutherland. If I tell her, she won't believe me. You may remember the old Persian saying, 'There's danger for him who taketh a tiger cub, and danger also for whoso snatches a delusion from a woman.' There's much sense in Hafiz as Horace, and as much knowledge of the world." Alright, folks, that's where we're going to leave it off for tonight. Next week, we will come back for the 4th adventure, the Boscombe Valley Mystery. In the meanwhile, there is, as usual, going to be a video on Monday. We're playing Legend of Zelda finally. I'm real excited about it, honestly. LGBT&D is on Sunday. Feel free to drop in on that. We've been working on the VODs channel for that, actually, Raz and I, and we're up to episode 23 right now, out of 27 or 28, so we're making good time. Anyway, that's it from me this evening. Do I have anything else to promote? Wednesday night streams may or may not happen, as I've mentioned on a couple other occasions. It really comes down to how much energy I have for that sort of thing. But anyway, guys, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.